I'm Jasmine Maise, 42, and for 23 years, I've quietly served my country in ways my own children never truly understood. While other parents coached Little League or attended PTA meetings, I was often called away on missions I couldn't discuss, carrying burdens I couldn't share. My teenagers would roll their eyes when I mentioned my work, dismissing it as just another government job. No big deal, Mom. But last month, on my 42nd birthday, everything changed. As I sat in my modest suburban kitchen, expecting another quiet celebration with store-bought cake and half-hearted happy birthdays, the doorbell rang. Standing on my doorstep weren't the usual neighbors or delivery drivers, it was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, flanked by men whose faces I'd only seen in classified briefings. The silence that followed would shatter 23 years of secrets and transform how my family saw me forever. The doorbell's chime cut through the quiet Saturday morning like a blade. I'd been expecting the grocery delivery, maybe Mrs. Henderson, from next door with her weekly gossip. Instead, through the frosted glass, I saw silhouettes that made my blood run cold. The unmistakable bearing of military officers in dress uniform. My heart hammered as I opened the door. General Patricia Elkins, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, stood on my modest front porch, flanked by two other officers I recognized from classified briefings. The morning sun glinted off their ribbons and stars, a stark contrast to my faded jeans and coffee-stained sweater. Colonel Maise, General Hawkins said, her voice carrying the authority I'd heard in countless secure communications. May we come in? Behind me, I heard the shuffle of teenage feet. Emma, my sibling, appeared in the hallway, her phone forgotten in her hand. Mom, who are these people? I stammered, my mind racing through security protocols. This wasn't supposed to happen. My two worlds weren't supposed to collide like this, not in my kitchen with its cheerful yellow walls and family photos. Colonel Maise, General Hawkins repeated, and I heard my son Jake's sharp intake of breath. He'd never heard anyone address me by rank before. To him, I was just Mom, the woman who forgot to pack his lunch and missed his basketball games. Please, come in, I managed, stepping aside. The three officers entered my home with the same precision they brought to Pentagon briefings. Their presence transformed my ordinary living room into something that felt classified, dangerous, important. Emma's eyes were wide as she took in the uniforms, the medals, the ceremonial swords. Mom, what's going on? Jake emerged from the kitchen, still wearing his pajamas, a piece of birthday cake in his hand. Why are there soldiers in our house? I'd spent 23 years keeping these worlds separate. My children knew I worked for the government, something vague and administrative. They'd never seen me in uniform, never heard about the missions, the medals, the late-night calls that took me away from their school plays and soccer games. Mrs. Maise, General Hawkins began, then corrected herself. Colonel Maise, we're here for a very special occasion. The weight of my hidden life pressed down on me. In my bedroom dresser, beneath old sweaters and forgotten jewelry, lay a letter I'd never shown my children. It was signed by the Secretary of Defense himself, commending my extraordinary heroism in the face of overwhelming enemy forces. During a classified operation in Eastern Europe, my kids had been in middle school then, annoyed that I'd missed Emma's science fair for what they thought was just another boring work trip. I don't understand, I whispered. Acutely aware of my children's confused stares, General Hawkins smiled, a rare expression I'd never seen in our professional interactions. Colonel, after 23 years of distinguished service, after everything you've sacrificed for this nation, it's time your family learned who you really are. The silence that followed was deafening. Emma's phone slipped from her fingers, clattering to the hardwood floor. Jake's piece of cake crumbled in his suddenly trembling hand. Mom. Emma's voice was small, uncertain. What does she mean? I looked at my children, these beautiful, complicated humans I'd raised while carrying secrets that could topple governments. For years, they'd dismissed my frequent absences, my inability to discuss work, my occasional exhaustion after business trips that were actually covert operations in hostile territory. There's something I need to tell you, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Something I've needed to tell you for a very long time. General Hawkins stepped forward, her aide carrying a mahogany box that seemed to hold the weight of history itself. The living room had never felt so small, so ordinary, yet somehow sacred. Emma and Jake pressed themselves against the wall, their eyes darting between me and the uniformed officers who had transformed our Saturday morning into something unprecedented. Colonel Jasmine Maise, General Hawkins began, her voice carrying the formality of a Pentagon ceremony, for 23 years. You have served your country with distinction, courage, and an unwavering commitment to protecting American lives. I felt my knees weaken. This couldn't be happening. Not here. Not now. Not in front of my children who thought I filed paperwork and attended boring meetings. The aide opened the mahogany box with practiced precision. Inside, nestled in blue velvet, lay a medal I'd only seen in photographs, the Medal of Honor, its star-shaped design catching the morning light streaming through my kitchen window. My breath caught in my throat. The President of the United States, General Hawkins, continued, has authorized me to present to you the Medal of Honor for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Emma's gasp was audible. Jake's mouth fell open, the forgotten cake crumbs falling from his fingers to the carpet I'd vacuumed just yesterday morning. Mom, Emma whispered, her voice cracking. The Medal of Honor. I couldn't speak. My hands trembled as memories flooded back the night in Kosovo when everything went wrong, when my team was surrounded and outnumbered, when I made the decision that saved 17 lives but nearly cost me my own. The children had been 9 and 11 then, asking why Mommy was in the hospital for so long, why she couldn't play catch or help with homework for months. During Operation Silent Guardian, General Hawkins read from an official document. Colonel Maise single-handedly held off enemy forces for 6 hours while coordinating the evacuation of civilian refugees and wounded soldiers. Despite being wounded herself, she refused medical attention until all personnel were safely extracted. Jake's eyes were filling with tears. You were hurt. When I remembered telling them I'd fallen downstairs at work, explaining away the crutches and the long recovery. They'd been so young, so innocent. How could I have explained that their mother had been in a firefight in a country they couldn't pronounce? The ceremony continued in my living room. This sacred space where we'd opened Christmas presents and celebrated birthdays. Where I'd helped with homework and bandaged skinned knees. Outside, I could see neighbors gathering on their porches, drawn by the government vehicles parked in my driveway. The courage displayed by Colonel Maise, General Hawkins continued, prevented what intelligence estimates suggest could have been a massacre of over 200 innocent civilians. Emma was crying now, silent tears streaming down her face. This was her mother, the woman she'd accused of caring more about work than family. The woman she'd told her friends was just a boring government employee. Your mother, General Hawkins said, addressing my children directly, is one of the finest soldiers this nation has ever produced. Her actions have saved countless lives, prevented international incidents, and protected freedoms that most Americans will never even know were threatened. The medal felt impossibly heavy as she placed it around my neck. 23 years of secrets, of missed recitals and parent-teacher conferences, of bedtime stories cut short by encrypted phone calls, all of it crystallized in this moment. I never wanted you to know, I whispered to my children. I never wanted you to worry, to understand the dangers. Jake stepped forward, his teenage bravado crumbling. Mom, why didn't you tell us? Because, I said, my voice breaking, I wanted you to have normal lives. I wanted you to sleep safely at night without knowing that sometimes Mommy was in places where people were trying to kill her. Emma rushed to my side, throwing her arms around me. We thought you didn't care about us. We thought work was more important than family. The weight of their misunderstanding hit me like a physical blow. All those years of thinking I was protecting them, I'd been building walls between us instead. General Hawkins cleared her throat gently. Colonel Maise, your service record shows 37 successful missions, 14 commendations for valor, and 0 mission failures. You've earned the respect of every service member who's ever served alongside you. Through the window, I could see Mrs. Henderson from next door, her hand covering her mouth in shock. The mailman had stopped his truck, staring at the military escort vehicles. My secret life was spilling into the suburban street where I'd tried so hard to be just another single mom. Your children, General Hawkins continued, should know that their mother is a hero in the truest sense of the word. She's earned a place in history. But as I looked at Emma and Jake, as I felt the weight of the medal against my chest, I realized that their understanding was the only recognition I'd ever truly wanted. I was 19 when I first walked into that Army recruiting station in downtown Phoenix. My college acceptance letter folded in my back pocket, alongside my resolve to serve something bigger than myself. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as Sergeant Rodriguez looked up from his desk, sizing up the slight blonde girl in jeans and a faded high school t-shirt. You sure about this, honey? he'd asked, his voice kind but skeptical. College is a pretty good option for someone like you. But I'd already made my decision. My father had served in Vietnam, never talked about it. But I'd seen the way he carried himself, the quiet dignity, the unspoken understanding that some things were worth sacrificing for. My mother had worried, pleaded, even cried, but she'd signed the papers when I turned 18. The enlistment papers felt momentous in my hands that day. Jasmine Elizabeth Parker, I'd written in careful cursive. Not knowing that name would change to Mattia just 3 years later. Not knowing that the signature I was scrawling would bind me to a life of secrets that would span over 2 decades. Basic training at Fort Benning was a shock to my suburban sensibilities. The drill sergeants seemed to take particular pleasure in breaking down the college girl, as they called me. But I'd grown up with 3 brothers, knew how to take a hit and keep going. More importantly, I'd discovered I had a gift for languages, a skill that would later make me invaluable in intelligence operations. It was during advanced individual training that I met David Maise. He was tall, serious, with dark eyes that seemed to see everything. While other soldiers grabbed beers at the PX, David spent his evenings studying maps, memorizing foreign phrases, preparing for a career that would take him to every corner of the world. "You're going to be wasted in regular infantry," he told me one evening as we walked the perimeter of the base. "Have you considered intelligence?" I hadn't, but David saw something in me that I was only beginning to understand myself. He helped me apply for the programs that would eventually lead to my specialization in counterterrorism, my fluency in 4 languages, my ability to disappear into foreign cultures and emerge with information that would save lives. We were married. In a small ceremony at the base chapel, both of us in dress uniform, both of us already committed to a life that would test every vow we made. Emma was born 2 years later, during David's deployment to Bosnia. I was a new lieutenant then, still learning to balance the demands of motherhood with the requirements of a military career that was becoming increasingly classified. Jake arrived 3 years after Emma, and by then, I was already being selected for missions that I couldn't discuss even with David. The children grew up thinking that Mommy and Daddy simply worked for the Army, a phrase that meant nothing to them beyond the occasional move to a new base. New schools, new friends. Those early years feel like a different lifetime now. I remember pushing Emma on the swings at the base playground while discussing extraction protocols on my secure phone. I remember Jake's first steps, taken while I was reviewing intelligence reports at the kitchen table, bouncing him on my knee between pages of classified documents. David understood the weight of what we'd chosen. He'd been recruited for similar work, though our paths rarely crossed professionally. We were both carrying secrets, both serving in ways that our families and even our children could never fully comprehend. "They'll understand someday," David would say when I worried about the missed birthdays, the vague explanations for why Mommy had to travel so much. "When they're older, they'll understand that what we're doing matters." But David died when Emma was 12 and Jake was 9, killed in an operation that I'm still not cleared to discuss. The folded flag they presented to me at his funeral sits in my bedroom closet, a reminder of the price we all paid for service. The children blamed the military for taking their father, blamed me for choosing a life that had cost us so much. After David's death, I could have left the service, taken a civilian job, given my children the stable, predictable life they deserved. Instead, I threw myself deeper into the work, as if each successful mission might somehow honor his sacrifice. I became better at what I did, more valuable to my country, and increasingly distant from the 2 people who needed me most. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was protecting freedom, defending democracy, saving lives around the world, while my own children grew up feeling abandoned by the woman who was supposed to love them above all else. Every classified mission was a choice between duty and family, between the greater good and the 2 hearts beating in my own home. I kept David's last letter to me folded in my uniform pocket during every deployment. "Take care of them," it said, "but take care of yourself too. They need their mother to come home." For 23 years, I've been trying to honor both parts of that request, never quite succeeding at either. The encrypted phone would buzz at the most inconvenient moments. During Emma's piano recital, I'd feel the vibration against my hip and know that somewhere in the world, people were about to die if I didn't answer. During Jake's Little League games, I'd slip away to the parking lot to receive mission parameters that would take me to places my children couldn't even pronounce. The mission brief for Operation Silent Guardian arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was making pancakes for breakfast. Emma was complaining about her algebra test. Jake was searching for his science project, and the encrypted tablet in my briefcase was pulsing with urgent classifications that would change everything. "Mom, you're burning the pancakes," Emma said, not looking up from her textbook. I was reading about a terrorist cell in Kosovo, about 17 American aid workers who'd been taken hostage, about intelligence suggesting they had less than 7 hours to live. The spatula trembled in my hand as I flipped the pancakes, my mind already calculating travel times, extraction routes, backup plans. "Sorry, honey," I murmured, but I was already gone. Already planning an operation that would take me 6,000 miles away from this kitchen. This life, these children who had no idea their mother was about to walk into a war zone. The cover story was always the same: Mommy has to travel for work. The children had heard it so many times it had lost all meaning. They'd roll their eyes, ask Mrs. Henderson from next door to stay with them, and go about their lives as if their mother's absence was as ordinary as grocery shopping. But Operation Silent Guardian was different. This wasn't surveillance or intelligence gathering. This was combat, pure and simple. The hostages were being held in a compound outside Pristina, surrounded by heavily armed militants who had nothing to lose and everything to prove. I kissed Emma and Jake goodbye on a Wednesday morning, the taste of maple syrup still on my lips, the weight of my gear bag heavy on my shoulder. They barely looked up from their cereal bowls. "How long this time?" Jake asked, his voice flat with resignation. 2 weeks, I lied. I had no idea how long it would take, or if I'd come back at all. The flight to Ramstein Air Base gave me time to study the mission parameters. The hostages were being held in a former school building, their captors using them as human shields while negotiating for the release of imprisoned militants. Satellite imagery showed multiple entry points, but all of them exposed, all of them deadly. My team was small, just 4 of us, all volunteers, all aware that this was likely a one-way mission. Captain Rodriguez, a demolitions expert from Texas. Lieutenant Kim, a sniper who could thread a needle at 600 yards. Sergeant Williams, a communications specialist who could hack into any system ever designed. And me, the team leader, the one who'd gotten them all into this mess. We inserted under cover of darkness, using a route that took us through hostile territory for 12 miles. The school building sat in a valley surrounded by hills, each ridgeline potentially hiding enemy spotters. Every step was calculated, every breath measured, every heartbeat a countdown to combat. The first shot came at 0347 hours, just as we were establishing our perimeter. Rodriguez went down immediately, his leg shattered by sniper fire. Kim returned fire, her shot echoing across the valley like thunder. Williams was already calling for extraction while I made the decision that would haunt me for the rest of my life. "We're going in," I whispered into my radio. 17 American lives are worth the risk. What followed was 6 hours of hell. We fought our way into the compound, room by room, floor by floor. The hostages were in the basement, terrified and traumatized but alive. Rodriguez was bleeding out in the courtyard. Kim was providing covering fire from a position that was becoming increasingly untenable. I carried 3 hostages out on my back, one at a time, while enemy fire shattered the windows above us. Williams carried Rodriguez, his massive frame protecting the wounded soldier from the bullets that were coming from every direction. Kim held her position until the last hostage was clear, then sprinted for the extraction point as the building began to collapse from the explosive charges Rodriguez had managed to set before being wounded. We lost Kim 50 yards from the helicopter. A single shot from a hidden position, and she was gone. I carried her body the remaining distance, refusing to leave her behind, refusing to let her sacrifice be in vain. The helicopter ride back to base was silent except for the sound of Rodriguez's labored breathing and the steady thrum of the rotors. 17 Americans were going home to their families. Kim was going home in a flag-draped coffin. I was going home to children who would ask why I'd been gone so long, why I looked so tired, why I couldn't talk about my business trip. The mission was classified at the highest levels. No news reports, no public recognition, no acknowledgement that Operation Silent Guardian had even occurred. The families of the rescued hostages would never know my name, never understand that their loved ones were alive because 4 soldiers had walked into hell and only 3 had walked out. I returned to find Emma angry that I'd missed her science fair, Jake disappointed that I'd missed his championship game. They saw my injuries, the bandages, the limping, the way I flinched when they hugged me too tightly and assumed I'd been clumsy, careless. You really need to be more careful at work, Mom, Emma said, helping me with my suitcase. It's just a desk job. If only she knew that her mother had just prevented an international incident, that the woman she thought filed paperwork had actually filed a mission report recommending Kim for a posthumous Medal of Honor. If only she knew that the boring government employee had 17 families to thank for bringing their loved ones home. But secrets have weight, and I carried them all. Every mission, every life saved, every sacrifice made in the name of freedom. The children saw only my absence, my exhaustion, my inability to explain why their mother was always somewhere else. Always protecting people they'd never meet from threats they'd never understand. The hardest part wasn't the combat or the classified briefings or the constant travel. The hardest part was coming home to children who thought their mother's life was insignificant, who dismissed her service as no big deal, who had no idea that their ordinary suburban house was home to a woman who'd helped shape the course of history, one classified mission at a time. The refrigerator calendar told the story of my failures better than any mission report ever could. Red circles around Emma's piano recital, Jake's science fair, parent-teacher conferences, all marked with my careful handwriting, all crossed out with the black ink of duty calling. Emma's spring recital was marked for April 15th, a date I'd circled months in advance, promising myself that nothing would interfere with hearing her play Chopin's Minute Waltz. She'd been practicing for weeks, her fingers flying over the keys with a precision that reminded me of my own attention to detail. In mission planning, you'll be there, right, Mom? She'd asked the night before, her 13-year-old eyes holding a vulnerability she rarely showed. Mrs. Peterson said all the parents are coming. Of course, sweetheart, I'd promised, ignoring the secure phone that had been buzzing in my briefcase all evening. I wouldn't miss it for the world. But at 0600 hours that morning, the call came that changed everything. Intelligence had identified the location of a chemical weapons facility in Syria, and the window for destruction was closing rapidly. Lives hung in the balance, not just American lives, but thousands of innocent civilians who had no idea. They were living in the shadow of weapons that could kill them in their sleep. I stood in Emma's doorway, watching her sleep, the recital program on her nightstand, with my name listed in the special thanks section. The mission brief was explicit. Immediate departure required. Duration classified. Success critical to national security. Emma, I whispered, gently shaking her shoulder. Honey, I need to tell you something. Her eyes opened, immediately alert to the tone in my voice. You're leaving, she said flatly. It wasn't a question. There's an emergency at work, I began, hating myself for the lie, for the way her face immediately closed off. I'll be back as soon as I can. You promised, she said, turning away from me. You actually promised this time. I kissed her forehead, tasting the salt of tears I couldn't shed. I know, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Jake's 8th grade graduation fell on a Tuesday in June. I'd requested leave months in advance, blocked the date in my calendar, even bought a new dress for the ceremony, but 48 hours before the ceremony, satellite imagery revealed terrorist activity at 3 locations across Eastern Europe. And I was the only operative with the language skills and cultural knowledge to infiltrate the cells. Mrs. Henderson agreed to attend in my place, to record the ceremony, to be the supportive adult figure Jake needed when his name was called. I watched the video later, on a plane over the Atlantic. Seeing my son's face scan the audience, looking for me, his smile fading when he realized I wasn't there. Mom had to work, I heard him tell his friend in the video, his voice carefully neutral. She always has to work. The birthday parties became a source of constant anxiety. Emma's Sweet 16 was scheduled for a Saturday in November, a date that should have been safe, sacred, untouchable. But intelligence agencies don't observe American social customs, and neither do international terrorists. The invitation list was carefully crafted. The decorations planned for weeks. The cake ordered from the bakery downtown. Emma had even asked me to help her pick out a dress, a rare moment of mother-daughter bonding that I'd treasured. This is going to be perfect, she'd said, modeling the blue dress that brought out her eyes. All my friends will be there, and you'll finally meet their parents. But 3 days before the party, encrypted communications revealed a plot against an American embassy in North Africa. The timeline was critical, the intelligence actionable, the need for immediate deployment non-negotiable. I called from a secure phone at the airport, the sounds of departure announcements echoing in the background. Emma, I need you to listen carefully. Don't, she said, her voice sharp with pain. "Don't you dare tell me you're leaving. There's been an emergency, there's always an emergency." She screamed, and I heard the phone hit the wall, heard her sobbing, heard Mrs. Henderson's voice in the background trying to comfort her. Jake picked up the phone. "Mom, Emma's really upset." "I know, baby. I know. Tell her, I'll make it up to her." "Okay, tell her, I love her." "She says she doesn't want you to make it up to her," Jake said quietly. "She says she wants you to just be here." The mission was successful. The embassy was secured. The plot disrupted. Dozens of lives saved. But when I returned home 5 days later, Emma's birthday decorations were still hanging in the living room. Wilted and forgotten. A monument to another promise broken. Parent-teacher conferences became exercises in damage control. I'd arrive, straight from the airport, still carrying the weight of classified operations. Trying to focus on algebra grades and social studies projects, while my mind was still calculating extraction routes and threat assessments. Mrs. Masha, Emma's 7th grade teacher, said, her voice carefully neutral. "Emma is a bright student, but she seems to struggle with feelings of abandonment. She's mentioned that you travel frequently for work." How could I explain that my work travel had just prevented a nuclear facility from falling into terrorist hands? How could I tell a suburban teacher that the woman sitting across from her in wrinkled khakis and a government-issue blazer had just spent 3 weeks in a hostile country, gathering intelligence that would shape international policy for the next decade? "I do what I can," I said, knowing it wasn't enough, knowing that Emma deserved better than a mother who was always somewhere else, always protecting other people's children while her own daughter felt neglected and unloved. The calendar on my refrigerator became a testament to good intentions and broken promises. Each red circle represented hope, each black line through a date represented failure. By the time Emma was in high school, she'd stopped asking me to mark events on the calendar altogether. "Don't bother," she'd say when I'd reach for the red pen. "You'll just find some reason to cancel anyway." Jake learned to expect disappointment. His little league games, his school plays, his science fairs, all attended by Mrs. Henderson with her supportive smile and her digital camera, recording moments that his mother should have witnessed firsthand. The worst part was coming home to find evidence of the life I'd missed. Emma's piano recital program tucked in a book. Jake's graduation photos scattered on the kitchen counter. Birthday party decorations that had been cleaned up without me. Celebrations that had happened in my absence. I kept them all in a box in my closet. Every program, every photo, every remnant of the moments I'd sacrificed for duty. Sometimes, late at night after returning from a mission, I'd open the box and try to piece together the family life I'd chosen to observe from a distance. The children learned to adapt, to expect less, to build their lives around the assumption that their mother would always be somewhere else when they needed her most. They became self-sufficient in ways that broke my heart, independent in ways that spoke to their resilience and my failure as a parent. By the time they were teenagers, they'd stopped saving me seats at school events, stopped asking when I'd be home, stopped believing that my work could ever be less important than their lives. They'd learned to dismiss my absence as routine, my apologies as meaningless, my promises as lies disguised as hope. The red circles on the calendar became fewer and farther between, eventually disappearing altogether as I accepted that duty and motherhood were incompatible forces in my life. I could serve my country or I could serve my children, but apparently, I couldn't do both. The knock on my door came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March. I knew before I opened it. Knew from the formal stance of the chaplain, the careful folding of the flag, the way the notification officer's eyes couldn't quite meet mine. David was gone. "Mrs. Mattia," the chaplain said, his voice gentle but practiced. "I regret to inform you that Major David Mattia was killed in action during a classified operation in Afghanistan." The words hit me like physical blows. Killed in action, classified, operation. The phrase that would become my life's refrain. The wall that would forever separate my grief from my children's need to understand. Emma was 12. Jake was 9. They stood behind me in the hallway, their eyes wide with the particular terror that comes from seeing your mother collapse. I remember the sound Emma made, not quite a scream, not quite a sob, and the way Jake's small hand found mine, squeezing with a strength that belied his age. "What happened to Daddy?" Emma whispered. "He was helping people," I managed. The official explanation that would have to suffice. He was helping people, and something went wrong. The funeral was everything military funerals should be: precise, honorable, steeped in tradition. The flag-draped casket, the 21-gun salute, the mournful notes of taps echoing across Arlington National Cemetery. David's colleagues from the intelligence community stood in formation, their faces grave with the weight of secrets they could never share. But Emma and Jake saw only the pageantry, not the significance. They saw their father's casket being lowered into the ground, saw their mother accepting a folded flag from strangers, saw the end of their childhood security wrapped in military ritual they didn't understand. Why did Daddy have to die? Jake asked that night, his 9-year-old logic struggling with concepts too complex for his young mind. Why couldn't he just have a normal job like other dads? I held him close, breathing in the scent of his shampoo, feeling the rapid beat of his heart against my chest. How could I explain that David had died preventing a terrorist attack that would have killed hundreds? How could I tell a 9-year-old that his father's sacrifice had saved countless other children from becoming orphans? Daddy believed in protecting people, I said finally. He believed it was worth any risk. But what about protecting us? Emma asked, her voice sharp with an anger that would only grow with time. What about protecting his own family? The question hung in the air between us, unanswerable and devastating. David had protected strangers, had saved lives around the world, had died in service to his country, but he'd also left behind 2 children who would grow up without their father, who would forever associate military service with loss and abandonment. The folded flag sits on my dresser now, a triangle of fabric that represents everything I loved and lost. Sometimes I catch Emma staring at it, her face unreadable. Sometimes Jake picks it up, running his fingers over the perfect creases, searching for some connection to the father he's rapidly forgetting. After the funeral, people told me I could leave the service. You've given enough, they said. Your children need you now. But David's death had the opposite effect on me. Instead of driving me away from the work, it pulled me deeper into it. Every mission became a memorial to David's sacrifice. Every successful operation was a way of honoring his memory. Every life saved was a testament to the values he'd died defending. I threw myself into the work with a fervor that bordered on obsession, as if each classified assignment could somehow justify the price my family had paid. The children saw my increased dedication to duty as evidence that I valued work more than family. They saw me leaving for longer deployments, accepting more dangerous assignments, volunteering for missions that other operators avoided. They couldn't understand that every classified operation was my way of grieving, my way of keeping David's memory alive. Mom cares more about her job than she does about us, Emma told Mrs. Henderson one afternoon. I'd overheard from the kitchen, where I was packing for a 3-week deployment to Eastern Europe. She didn't even cry at Daddy's funeral. But I had cried. I'd cried in embassy safehouses and on transport planes, in hotel rooms in foreign countries, and in the sterile corridors of classified facilities. I'd cried in places where my tears couldn't be witnessed, where my grief couldn't be shared, where my humanity had to remain hidden behind layers of security clearance and operational necessity. The children's resentment toward the military grew with each passing year. They blamed the army for taking their father, blamed my continued service for taking their mother. They saw the uniform as a symbol of abandonment, the flag as a reminder of loss, the very concept of service as a betrayal of family loyalty. I hate the army, Jake said one evening, his 12-year-old voice filled with venom. I hate everything about it. Jake, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, the army is why we're free. It's why we can live safely. I don't care about being free, he shot back. I care about having parents. The accusation was like a knife to my heart. I wanted to tell him about the chemical weapons facility I'd helped destroy, about the school bus full of children I'd saved from a roadside bomb, about the terrorist cell I'd infiltrated to prevent an attack on American soil. I wanted him to understand that his mother's work mattered, that the sacrifices our family had made were part of something larger than ourselves. But the classifications held. The secrets remained locked away, and my children continued to see me as a woman who chose duty over family, who valued the approval of strangers over the love of her own children. David's death changed everything about our family dynamics. Without his steadying influence, without his ability to help the children understand our shared commitment to service, I became the sole target of their anger and confusion. They blamed me for his death, for continuing the work that had killed him, for prioritizing a mission they couldn't understand over their need for stability and safety. The house felt empty without David's presence, without his quiet strength, and his ability to make the children laugh. The dinner table conversations became stilted, perfunctory. The bedtime stories stopped. The family game nights disappeared. We became strangers, living in the same house. Connected by blood, but separated by grief and secrets, and the growing gulf between duty and family. I kept David's coffee mug on the kitchen counter for months, as if he might walk through the door, at any moment, as if his death was just another deployment that would eventually end. The children would sometimes stare at it, their faces reflecting the same desperate hope that kept me from putting it away. Eventually, Emma moved it to the back of the cabinet. "He's not coming back, Mom," she said quietly. "We need to stop pretending he is." That night, I held the folded flag and wept for everything we'd lost, not just David, but the family we'd once been. The unity we'd once shared, the belief that service and sacrifice were noble concepts worthy of respect. His death had shattered more than just our hearts. It had destroyed our children's faith in the very ideals their father had died defending. The text message arrived while I was in a classified briefing about arms trafficking in Eastern Europe. My phone, set to silent, buzzed against my leg with an insistence that made my colleagues glance in my direction. I ignored it, focusing on the satellite images that showed weapons caches that needed to be secured before they fell into terrorist hands. But the buzzing continued, text after text, each one more urgent than the last. Finally, during a break in the briefing, I checked my phone and felt my blood run cold. "Your job is stupid and meaningless," Emma had written at 3:47 p.m. "You're just a government drone who files paperwork and pretends it's important." The next message, sent 20 minutes later, "Jake got suspended for fighting. He said he was defending you, but honestly, why bother? You're never here anyway." And then, the one that made my hands shake. "I told Mrs. Peterson that my mom works at the post office. It's easier than explaining that you have a boring desk job that's apparently more important than your own children." I excused myself from the briefing, stepping into the hallway where I could respond without compromising operational security. My fingers trembled as I typed, "Emma, what happened? Is Jake okay?" Her response was immediate and cutting. "Jake's fine. He got in a fight with Tyler Morrison because Tyler said military families are just government leeches who waste taxpayer money. Jake actually defended your service, which is hilarious because what exactly do you do besides travel for meetings?" I stared at the screen, my heart breaking for my son who had fought to defend something he didn't understand, who had stood up for a mother whose real contributions he would never know. The irony was devastating. Jake had been suspended for defending my honor while I sat in a room discussing operations that had saved thousands of lives. "I'm coming home," I typed, but Emma's response stopped me cold. "Don't bother. Mrs. Henderson is handling it. She's better at this mom stuff anyway." That night, I returned to a house filled with the kind of tension that makes breathing difficult. Jake sat at the kitchen table, his right eye swollen purple, his knuckles scraped raw. Emma was doing homework with aggressive concentration, her earbuds firmly in place to signal her unavailability for conversation. "Jake," I said softly, sitting beside him. "Tell me what happened." He looked up at me with eyes that held too much disappointment for a 14-year-old. "Tyler Morrison said Dad died for nothing. He said military families are just welfare cases with better PR." My chest tightened. "What did you say?" "I told him my mom was a hero. I told him you served your country and that your work mattered." His voice cracked on the last word. But then he laughed and asked what exactly you do, and I couldn't answer him, Mom. I had no idea what to say. The weight of my secrets felt crushing. Here was my son, bearing the consequences of defending something he couldn't explain. Something I'd never been able to share with him. "So I hid him," Jake continued. "Because even if I don't know what you do, I know you're my mom, and nobody gets to talk about Dad like that." Emma pulled out one earbud. "That's the problem, Jake. We don't know what she does. For all we know, Tyler's right. For all we know, Mom really is just a paper pusher who likes to travel." "Emma," I started, but she held up her hand. "Don't. Just don't. I'm 17 years old, and I've spent most of my life explaining to people why my mom is never around. Do you know what I tell them? I tell them you're important. I tell them your work matters, but honestly, I have no proof of that. None." She stood up, gathering her books with sharp, angry movements. "Jake got suspended, defending something he can't even describe. I've been lying to my friends for years about having a mother who actually cares about her family. We're both fighting battles for you, and we don't even know why." The next few months brought a steady stream of similar confrontations. Emma began introducing me to her friends as Jasmine instead of my mom. A subtle rejection that cut deeper than any argument. Jake stopped talking about school entirely. Tired of explaining his family situation to classmates who couldn't understand why his mother was always traveling for work. Their grades began to suffer. Emma, who had always been an honor student, started skipping classes. Jake's teachers called to express concern about his increasing aggression and social withdrawal. I attended parent-teacher conferences where educators delicately suggested that my children might benefit from more parental involvement and stability at home. Mrs. Mattia, Emma's guidance counselor, said during one particularly difficult meeting, "Emma has mentioned that you travel frequently for work. She seems to struggle with feelings of abandonment." How could I explain that my latest business trip had involved dismantling a human trafficking network that had been selling children into slavery? How could I tell a suburban school counselor that the mother she was describing as absent had just spent 3 weeks undercover in a criminal organization, gathering evidence that would lead to the arrest of 37 traffickers? "I do what I can," I said. The same inadequate response I'd been giving for years. Emma's rebellion took more creative forms. She started dating boys she knew I wouldn't approve of, not because they were bad kids, but because they represented everything anti-military. Her boyfriend Marcus had long hair, wore anti-war t-shirts, and made pointed comments about government propaganda whenever I was in the room. "It must be nice," Marcus said one evening, "having a mom who supports the military-industrial complex." Emma watched my face carefully, waiting for my reaction. I wanted to tell Marcus that I'd seen the aftermath of real evil, that I'd witnessed what happened when good people failed to act. I wanted to explain that the military-industrial complex he dismissed so casually had prevented chemical weapons from reaching American cities, had stopped terrorist cells from targeting school buses, had protected freedoms he exercised without thought or gratitude. Instead, I simply said, everyone has to find their own way to serve. Jake's rebellion was quieter but more devastating. He stopped asking about my work entirely, stopped showing any curiosity about my frequent absences. When I returned from missions, he'd greet me with polite indifference, treating me like a distant relative who occasionally visited. "How was your trip, Mom?" he'd ask, his tone perfectly neutral. "It was fine, honey. How was school?" "Fine." Our conversations became exercises in careful distance, each of us avoiding topics that might reveal too much pain or disappointment. Jake learned to expect nothing from me, and I learned to live with the knowledge that my own son saw me as a stranger who happened to share his address. The hardest part was hearing them defend me to others while simultaneously losing faith in me themselves. Emma would argue with friends who criticized military families, would passionately defend the concept of service and sacrifice. But at home, she'd look at me with eyes that held only questions and resentment. "I don't understand you," she said one night, cornering me in the kitchen after I'd returned from a 2-week deployment. "You talk about service and duty and protecting people, but you can't even protect your own children from feeling abandoned." Jake's phone was filled with messages from friends asking about his family situation. "Why is your mom gone so much? What does she actually do? Is she like a spy or something?" He'd show me the texts sometimes, his face a mixture of embarrassment and confusion. "I don't know what to tell them," he'd say. "I don't know what you do, so I can't defend it. I don't know why you leave, so I can't explain it. I feel stupid when people ask about my family." By the time Emma was a senior in high school, she'd completely detached from my military life. She refused to attend any military events, declined invitations to base functions, and made it clear that she wanted nothing to do with the culture that had shaped her childhood. "When I graduate," she told me, "I'm going to college as far away from here as possible. I'm going to study something that doesn't involve the government, the military, or anything that takes people away from their families." Jake, now 15, had developed a protective shell of indifference. He'd learned to cope with my absences by pretending they didn't matter, by building a life that didn't depend on my presence or participation. Their text messages to me became increasingly distant, filled with practical information but devoid of affection. "Need money for gas. Staying at friend's house tonight. Don't wait up." Each message was a small rejection, a reminder that they'd learned to live without me, that my children had adapted to my absence by simply not needing me anymore. The devastating irony was that they'd both inherited my sense of justice, my desire to protect others, my willingness to fight for what was right. But instead of seeing these qualities as reflections of the values I'd tried to instill, they saw them as evidence that they'd had to raise themselves. that they'd developed strength and character despite having a mother who was never there when they needed her most. The newspaper clipping arrived in my classified mail 3 weeks after Operation Nightfall ended. Page 6 of the Washington Post. Buried between stock reports and weather forecasts. A brief article titled, "Terrorist Plot Thwarted in Major U.S. City." The reporter had managed to piece together fragments of the story: a planned attack on a subway system, explosives intercepted, multiple arrests made. But the article revealed nothing about the 3-month infiltration operation that had made those arrests possible. Nothing about the intelligence operative who had posed as a sympathetic contact to gain the terrorists' trust. I read the sanitized version of my own operation while sitting in my car outside Emma's high school, waiting to pick her up from drama club practice. The article mentioned federal law enforcement agencies and coordinated efforts, but made no reference to the woman who had spent 96 days pretending to be someone else, who had risked her life to prevent what intelligence estimates suggested would have been the deadliest domestic terrorist attack since 9/11's. "Mom, you're late," Emma said, sliding into the passenger seat with the particular brand of teenage irritation reserved for parents who failed to meet expectations. "Sorry, honey," I said, folding the newspaper and tucking it into my briefcase. Traffic was heavy. She glanced at the briefcase, her expression shifting to the familiar mask of indifference she wore whenever anything work-related entered our conversations. More exciting government paperwork. If only she knew that the paperwork in my briefcase included commendations from the Director of National Intelligence, photographs of chemical weapons that would never reach American soil, and intelligence reports that detailed how her mother had prevented the deaths of potentially thousands of innocent people. Operation Nightfall had begun with intercepted communications, suggesting a coordinated attack on 3 major subway systems during rush hour. The target date was September 15, exactly 2 weeks before Emma's 18th birthday. The irony wasn't lost on me that while my daughter was planning her birthday party, her mother was working around the clock to ensure she'd live to see it. The terrorist cell was sophisticated, well-funded, and deeply embedded in the local community. Traditional surveillance had yielded limited intelligence, so the decision was made to place an operative inside the organization. I volunteered immediately. Despite knowing that the assignment would require me to disappear from my family's life for months, my cover was carefully constructed: Jasmine Parker, a radicalized widow whose military husband had been killed in Afghanistan. The backstory was close enough to my real life to be believable, but twisted just enough to make me sympathetic to their cause. They believed I was angry at the government that had taken my husband, desperate for revenge against the system that had destroyed my family. The irony of the cover story was devastating. I told the terrorists that I blamed the military for my husband's death, that I resented a government that had made me a single mother, that I wanted to strike back at the forces that had torn my family apart. Every word of my fabricated anger was rooted in real pain, making the deception both easier and more emotionally destructive than any operation I'd ever undertaken. For 3 months, I lived a double life that went far beyond the usual demands of undercover work. I attended terrorist planning meetings while missing Emma's college application deadlines. I helped transport explosives while Jake played in his championship basketball game. I provided intelligence about government security measures while my children believed their mother was simply working longer hours at her boring desk job. The terrorists trusted me because my pain was real. They believed my story because the grief I expressed was genuine, even if its target was fabricated. They saw a broken woman seeking revenge, not a highly trained operative gathering evidence that would lead to their capture. The planned attack was elaborate and devastating. 3 separate subway stations during morning rush hour, timed to maximize casualties and create maximum psychological impact. The bombs were sophisticated, the planning meticulous, the potential death toll staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested that a successful attack would have killed over 2,000 people and wounded thousands more. I provided the FBI with real-time intelligence about bomb locations, timing devices, and escape routes. My reports allowed law enforcement to coordinate a simultaneous raid that captured all 12 members of the cell, along with enough explosives to level a city block. The terrorists never knew that their trusted confidant had been feeding information to the very government they sought to destroy. The arrests made national news for exactly 1 day. The prevented attack was reported as a foiled terrorist plot, with generic statements from FBI officials about ongoing investigations and national security measures. No one reported that a single operative had spent 3 months in deep cover, that a mother of 2 had risked her life to prevent a massacre. that the woman who thwarted America's next major terrorist attack was worried about getting home in time to help her daughter with her college essay. Emma never knew that her mother's late nights at the office had been spent in terrorist safehouses, planning attacks against innocent civilians. Jake never knew that his mother's business trips had involved learning to construct improvised explosive devices and studying subway system blueprints. They saw only my increased absences, my distraction during family dinners, my inability to explain why I seemed so tired and emotionally drained. "You've been weird lately," Emma said one evening, about halfway through the operation. "Even weirder than usual." I was exhausted from the constant mental strain of maintaining my cover, from the psychological toll of pretending to support violence while working to prevent it. Every day required me to express hatred for the very country and values I'd sworn to protect. "Just busy at work," I said, the same inadequate explanation I'd been giving for years. "Right," Emma said, her voice flat with disbelief. "The mysterious government job that you can never talk about but somehow requires you to work 18-hour days." If only she knew that those 18-hour days had just prevented her high school from becoming a target. That her mother's exhaustion came from preventing an attack that would have made September 11th look like a preliminary exercise. The operation concluded with perfect precision. All 12 terrorists were arrested simultaneously, their weapons confiscated, their plans permanently disrupted. The subway systems they'd targeted remained safe. The thousands of commuters who rode those trains, never knowing how close they'd come to death. I returned home after the arrests with the same careful emotional distance I'd maintained throughout the operation. Emma was studying for her SATs, Jake was worried about making varsity basketball, and both of them treated my return as just another conclusion to another inexplicable absence. "How was your trip, Mom?" Jake asked, not looking up from his math homework. "Productive," I said, thinking about the thousands of lives that had been saved. The families who would never know they owed their safety to a woman they'd never meet. "Good," he said, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. 3 weeks later, the newspaper article appeared, and I realized that my children would never know the truth about Operation Nightfall. They would never understand that their mother had prevented a tragedy that would have fundamentally changed American society. They would never know that while they were worried about SAT scores and basketball tryouts, their mother was single-handedly dismantling a terrorist network that had planned to turn their hometown into a war zone. The medal ceremony was held in a classified location with no media coverage. The Director of National Intelligence presented me with a commendation that I could never display, never discuss, never share with the people whose opinion mattered most to me. Emma and Jake continued to believe that their mother worked a meaningless government job, that her frequent absences were just bureaucratic inefficiency, that her dedication to duty was misplaced loyalty to an organization that didn't deserve it. I kept the newspaper clipping in my classified files, a reminder that the most important work often goes unrecognized. That the greatest victories are the disasters that never happen. That sometimes being a hero means accepting that the people you love most will never understand the price you've paid to keep them safe. The call came on a Thursday morning while I was making Emma's lunch for her senior year. Colonel's insignia, the silver eagle that represented 20 years of service, sacrifice, and achievement. My commanding officer's voice carried the formal weight of military protocol, but I could hear the genuine pride beneath the official language. "Congratulations, Colonel Mattia. The promotion is effective immediately." I set down the peanut butter sandwich I'd been preparing and stared out the kitchen window at our suburban neighborhood. Mrs. Henderson was walking her dog. The mailman was making his rounds. Children were waiting for school buses. Normal people, living normal lives, protected by forces they'd never see or understand. "Thank you, sir," I said, my voice steady despite the emotion rising in my chest. "Colonel, after everything I'd sacrificed, every mission I'd completed, every secret I'd carried, this recognition meant something. Your new assignment comes with increased responsibilities," he continued. "Enhanced security clearance, oversight of multinational operations, direct reporting to Joint Chiefs level. This is the big leagues, Mattia." I thought about Emma upstairs, probably still deciding what to wear to school. I thought about Jake, who would stumble down for breakfast in 20 minutes, grabbing a piece of toast and rushing out the door. They had no idea their mother had just reached the pinnacle of a career they didn't understand. Had just been entrusted with responsibilities that would shape international policy. "I understand, sir. I won't let you down. You never have, Colonel. Your country is fortunate to have you." When I hung up the phone, The kitchen felt exactly the same as it had 5 minutes earlier. Same yellow walls, same family photos on the refrigerator, same breakfast dishes waiting to be cleared, but everything had changed. I was now Colonel Jasmine Maise, responsible for operations that spanned continents. Trusted with intelligence that could start or prevent wars. Emma wandered into the kitchen, her hair still messy from sleep, searching for her favorite coffee mug. "Mom, have you seen my thermos?" "Cabinet by the stove," I said, watching her move through our morning routine with the unconscious ease of someone who had never questioned whether her breakfast table was safe, whether her school bus route was secure, whether the country she lived in was protected from threats she couldn't imagine. "Thanks," she said, filling the thermos with coffee that was probably too strong for a 17-year-old. "Oh, by the way, I need you to sign my college application tonight. The deadline is tomorrow." College applications. While I was being promoted to oversee operations that could affect global stability, my daughter was worried about essay deadlines and recommendation letters. The disconnect was both heartbreaking and oddly comforting. "Of course," I said. "I'll be home by 7. "Will you really?" she asked, her tone carrying the weight of 18 years of broken promises. "Because if you're going to be late, I can forge your signature. I've gotten pretty good at it." The casual admission that my daughter had learned to forge my signature hit me like a physical blow. She'd become so accustomed to my absences that she'd developed contingency plans, backup systems for when her mother inevitably failed to be present for important moments. "I'll be here," I promised, knowing that my new position would likely make such promises even harder to keep. Jake appeared in the doorway, his basketball bag slung over his shoulder, his face still showing the indentations of his pillow. "Morning, Mom. Any exciting government paperwork today?" If only he knew that my government paperwork now included briefings from the CIA, strategy sessions with foreign intelligence services, and operational plans that required presidential approval. If only he knew that his mother had just been entrusted with secrets that could topple governments. "Something like that," I said, ruffling his hair as he passed. "Good luck with your chemistry test." "Thanks," he said, grabbing an apple from the counter. "See you tonight, maybe." The maybe was delivered without malice. Just the realistic expectation of a 16-year-old who had learned not to count on his mother's presence. He kissed my cheek and headed for the door, leaving me alone with the weight of my new responsibilities and the familiar ache of being misunderstood by the people who mattered most. My first briefing as a colonel took place in the Pentagon. In a room I'd only heard described in classified reports. The security checks were more rigorous, the clearance levels higher, the information more sensitive than anything I'd handled before. I sat at a conference table with generals and intelligence directors, discussing operations that would reshape the global balance of power. Colonel Maise, the director of operations, said, "Your new position requires complete operational flexibility. You'll be traveling extensively, often with little notice. Are your personal circumstances compatible with these demands?" Personal circumstances. He was asking about my family, about my ability to prioritize duty over motherhood, about whether my children's needs would interfere with national security objectives. "Completely compatible, sir," I said, hating myself for the lie. Knowing that every mission would take me further away from Emma and Jake, would add to the growing list of promises broken in service to my country. The colonel's insignia felt heavy on my shoulders as I drove home that evening. I'd stopped at the jewelry store to buy a small gift for Emma's silver necklace to celebrate her college applications. A gesture that felt inadequate compared to the magnitude of the day. But how do you celebrate a promotion your family doesn't understand with children who've learned not to expect celebrations? Dinner was quiet, efficient, devoid of the warmth that should have marked such an important milestone. Emma signed her college application while eating leftover Chinese takeout. Jake did homework between bites of pizza. I sat at the head of the table, wearing the insignia of one of the highest-ranking intelligence officers in the country, feeling like a stranger in my own home. "How was everyone's day?" I asked, attempting the kind of family conversation that normal families probably had naturally. "Fine," Emma said, not looking up from her application. "Okay," Jake added, his attention focused on his chemistry notes. I wanted to tell them about the promotion, about the recognition of 20 years of sacrifice and service. I wanted to share the pride I felt, the validation that came with being trusted at the highest levels of government. I wanted them to understand that their mother had just reached a pinnacle that few people ever achieve. Instead, I said, I might have to travel more for work in the coming months. Emma's pen stopped moving. Jake looked up from his textbook. The silence that followed was filled with the weight of 18 years of similar announcements. Of course you will, Emma said finally, her voice flat with resignation. Just promise me you'll be here for graduation. I promise, I said, knowing that my new position made such promises even more meaningless than before. Knowing that colonel-level responsibilities didn't pause for high school graduations or family celebrations. That night, I sat in my bedroom, looking at the colonel's insignia in its presentation box. 20 years of service, countless missions completed, thousands of lives saved, and the only people whose approval I truly wanted would never know what I'd achieved. The promotion that should have been a celebration became another secret I had to carry alone. Another accomplishment I couldn't share with my children. The next morning brought my first assignment as a colonel, a multinational operation that would require 6 weeks in Southeast Asia. As I packed my bag and prepared to leave for another mission that Emma and Jake would dismiss as another boring business trip, I realized that my promotion had only widened the gulf between my public service and my private life. I was now one of the most powerful intelligence officers in the country, trusted with America's most sensitive secrets, responsible for operations that would shape the future of international relations. But I was still just mom to Emma and Jake, the woman who traveled too much, who missed too many important moments, who seemed to care more about strangers than about her own family. The colonel's insignia represented everything I'd worked for and everything I'd sacrificed. It was a symbol of achievement that I wore in classified briefings and Pentagon meetings, but never at home. Never where the people who'd paid the highest price for my service could see that their mother's work actually mattered. That her sacrifices had meaning beyond their understanding. The concert tickets arrived on the same day as the emergency briefing. 2 front row seats to see Arcade Fire's favorite band, performing just an hour away, on her 18th birthday. I'd pulled strings, called in favors, spent more money than I should have, but I'd gotten the impossible tickets that would make her birthday perfect. Mom, you didn't, Emma said when I surprised her with the tickets that Tuesday evening. For the first time in months, her face lit up with genuine excitement. The kind of joy I remembered from when she was little and I was simply her mother, not a woman with classified obligations. Front row, I said, grinning at her reaction. You and me, birthday girl. No phones, no work, no distractions. Just us and your favorite music. She threw her arms around me, and for a moment, I remembered what it felt like to be the most important person in my daughter's world. This is going to be amazing, Mom. I can't believe you actually did something fun. The comment stung, but I pushed away the hurt. This was my chance to show Emma that she mattered more than anything else, that her mother could prioritize family over duty. That some promises were too important to break. I even requested leave, I told her, which wasn't entirely true. I'd blocked the date on my calendar, but in my line of work, leave was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. Nothing is going to interfere with your birthday. Emma spent the next 3 days planning our mother-daughter evening with an enthusiasm I hadn't seen since she was in middle school. She researched the opening band, created a playlist for the drive, even suggested we get dinner beforehand at the Italian restaurant where we'd celebrated her 13th birthday. This might actually be fun, she said Friday morning, the day before the concert. When was the last time we did something together? Just us? I couldn't remember, and that realization was devastating. When had my daughter's life become so separate from mine that spending an evening together felt like a special occasion? The encrypted phone rang at 0347 hours on Saturday morning, 4 hours before Emma and I were supposed to leave for her birthday celebration. I knew before I answered that everything was about to fall apart. Colonel Mattia, the voice was crisp, urgent, unmistakably official. We have a situation developing in Eastern Europe. Intelligence suggests an imminent attack on NATO facilities. Your expertise in the region makes you essential to the response team. I sat on the edge of my bed, watching Emma sleep in the room across the hall, her concert outfit already laid out on her chair. The tickets carefully placed on her nightstand. She'd gone to bed early, too excited to sleep, talking about how perfect the evening was going to be. Sir, I'm on scheduled leave, I said quietly, hoping against hope that someone else could handle whatever crisis was developing 6,000 miles away. Colonel, this is a potential Article 5 situation. If NATO invokes collective defense, we could be looking at the beginning of a much larger conflict. Your language skills and intelligence contacts in the region are critical to preventing escalation. Article 5. An attack on one NATO member considered an attack on all. The kind of situation that could spiral into World War if not handled properly. The kind of crisis that trumped birthday concerts and mother-daughter bonding and every personal priority I'd ever had. How long? I asked, already knowing the answer would destroy everything Emma and I had planned. Minimum 72 hours. Possibly longer. Departure is in 2 hours. 2 hours. Barely enough time to pack. Certainly not enough time to explain to my daughter why her mother was about to shatter another promise. Why duty was once again proving more important than family. I sat in Emma's doorway, watching her sleep peacefully, her hair spread across the pillow, her face relaxed in a way I rarely saw anymore. In 6 hours, we were supposed to be driving to dinner, singing along to her playlist, getting excited about the concert that was going to mark her transition into adulthood. Instead, I was going to wake her up to deliver another devastating disappointment, another reminder that her mother's love came with conditions and limitations, another example of why she'd learned not to depend on me for anything important. Emma, I whispered, gently touching her shoulder. Honey, I need to talk to you. Her eyes opened immediately, and I saw the exact moment she processed my expression. Saw the hope drain from her face as she understood what was coming. No, she said, sitting up abruptly. No, Mom, you promised. You actually promised this time. There's an emergency, there's always an emergency. She screamed, and I heard Jake's door open down the hall. You got me the perfect tickets. You made me believe that for once, just once, I might actually matter more than your stupid job. Emma, you do matter. You matter more than anything. Then don't go, she said, tears streaming down her face. If I really matter, if your family really comes first, then tell them no. Tell them to send someone else. How could I explain that someone else didn't exist? That my specific knowledge and contacts might be the difference between a contained crisis and a global catastrophe? That saying no could mean NATO forces walking into a trap. Could mean American soldiers dying because their intelligence officer chose a concert over duty. I can't, I whispered. I wish I could, but I can't. Emma stared at me for a long moment, and I watched 18 years of accumulated disappointment crystallize into something harder, more final. I know, she said quietly. I've always known that when it really matters, when I really need you, you'll choose something else. Jake appeared in the doorway, his hair messy from sleep, his face reflecting the same resignation I saw in Emma's eyes. Let me guess, he said. Mom has to save the world again. The sarcasm in his voice was like a knife to my heart. My 16-year-old son had learned to mock my service because he'd never seen evidence that it mattered, had never been allowed to understand that his mother's work had prevented the very wars that would have destroyed his peaceful suburban existence. I'll make it up to you, I said to Emma, knowing the words were meaningless. Knowing I'd said them so many times they'd lost all power to comfort. Don't, she said, lying back down and pulling the covers over her head. Just don't. I'm done pretending that your promises mean anything. I packed in silence while my children stayed in their rooms, doors closed, effectively shutting me out of their lives. The concert tickets sat on Emma's nightstand. A $400 reminder of another failed attempt to prioritize family over duty. Mrs. Henderson arrived as I was loading my bag into the car. She'd been my emergency contact for so many years that she barely asked questions anymore. Simply accepted that she'd be caring for my children, while their mother disappeared to handle another crisis they'd never understand. How long this time? She asked, her voice carefully neutral. At least 3 days, I said. Emma's really upset about the concert. Double quotes. Mrs. Henderson nodded sadly. She's been talking about it all week. She was so excited that you were finally doing something together. The guilt was crushing. This woman, who wasn't even family, understood my children's needs better than I did, had provided more consistent emotional support than their own mother. Emma and Jake had learned to count on Mrs. Henderson's presence while treating mine as a pleasant surprise rather than an expectation. The flight to Eastern Europe gave me 12 hours to contemplate the wreckage of my latest attempt at normal motherhood. The crisis was real. Intelligence showed a coordinated attack planned against 3 NATO installations, with Russian involvement. Suspected. My contacts in the region provided crucial information that prevented what could have escalated into a shooting war. The operation was successful. The attacks were prevented. The intelligence networks disrupted. The potential for broader conflict eliminated. I returned home after 4 days with commendations from allied governments and the satisfaction of another mission completed successfully. Emma was in her room when I got home. The concert tickets still on her nightstand, now just expensive pieces of paper that represented everything wrong with our relationship. She didn't speak to me for a week, and when she finally did, it was to inform me that she'd decided to attend college on the opposite coast. "I need distance," she said simply. "I need to build a life that doesn't depend on other people's promises." Jake had become even more withdrawn, spending most of his time at friends' houses where the adults showed up when they said they would, where family plans weren't subject to the whims of international crises. The unused concert tickets became a symbol of all my failures as a mother. A reminder that good intentions weren't enough, that love without reliability was just another form of abandonment. I kept them in my desk drawer, two pieces of paper that represented the gulf between my desire to be a good mother and the realities of a life lived in service to something larger than family. Every time I opened that drawer, I saw Emma's face, on her 18th birthday morning, bright with anticipation and trust. I saw the moment that hope died, replaced by the hard-earned wisdom that her mother's love came with an asterisk. That every promise carried the unspoken caveat, unless something more important comes up. The tickets were a $400 lesson in the cost of service. A reminder that some sacrifices can't be explained or justified to the people who paid the highest price for them. Jake's graduation was scheduled for June 15th at 2 p.m. I'd marked it on every calendar I owned, blocked the entire day, even turned down a NATO briefing to ensure nothing would interfere. This time would be different. This time, I would be the mother sitting in the audience, cheering when my son's name was called. Proving that family could come first. The letter from the Secretary of Defense arrived at 11:47 a.m. on June 14th, marked with the red classification stamps that had ruled my life for 23 years. Inside was a single page of orders that would once again force me to choose between duty and family, between the security of strangers and the emotional needs of my own son. Operation Blackwater requires immediate deployment, the orders read. Intelligence indicates imminent terrorist attack on American embassy in Ankara. Colonel Matthias, expertise essential for hostage rescue coordination. Departure, 0600 hours, June 15th, June 15th. The same day my son was scheduled to walk across a stage and receive his high school diploma. The same day I'd promised to be in the audience. The same day I'd sworn would belong entirely to my family. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the orders, watching the clock tick toward Jake's graduation ceremony. 24 hours. That's all I needed, 24 hours to be a normal mother, to cheer for my son, to show him that he mattered more than anything else in the world. But 57 American embassy personnel were being held hostage by a terrorist organization. With a history of executing prisoners, the intelligence was time-sensitive, the rescue window narrow. The stakes measured in American lives that hung in the balance while I worried about missing a graduation ceremony. Jake found me at the kitchen table at midnight, still staring at the orders, still paralyzed by an impossible choice. "Mom, are you okay?" I looked up at my son, 17 years old, valedictorian heading to Stanford on a full scholarship, the product of his own determination rather than any guidance I'd provided. He was everything I'd ever wanted him to be, and I'd missed most of the moments that had shaped him into this remarkable young man. "I'm fine, honey," I said, quickly sliding the classified orders into my briefcase. "Just some work stuff. Are you excited about tomorrow?" His face lit up with the kind of enthusiasm I rarely saw anymore. "I can't believe I'm actually graduating. And you'll be there, right? You promised you'd be there." The hope in his voice was devastating. After years of broken promises and missed milestones, Jake was still capable of believing that this time might be different, that his mother might, finally, prioritize his needs over her mysterious government obligations. "Of course I'll be there," I said, the lie burning in my throat. I wouldn't miss it for anything. We sat together in comfortable silence, the kind of peaceful moment that had become rare in our house. Jake talked about his graduation speech, about his plans for Stanford, about his hopes for the future. I listened and nodded and tried to memorize every word, knowing that in 6 hours I'd be betraying his trust one final time, at 0500 hours. I stood in Jake's doorway, watching him sleep. His graduation gown hung on his closet door, carefully pressed and ready for the ceremony. His speech notes were on his desk, covered with revisions and improvements he'd made the night before. Everything was perfect except for the fact that his mother wouldn't be there to witness his moment of triumph. I left a note on the kitchen counter. The same cowardly approach I'd used so many times before. "Emergency at work. So proud of you. We'll make it up to you. Love, Mom." The words felt hollow, meaningless, a band-aid applied to a wound that had been bleeding for 17 years. How do you make up for missing your child's graduation? How do you explain that saving strangers' lives was more important than celebrating your son's achievements? The flight to Turkey gave me 8 hours to draft a resignation letter that I'd never submit. After 23 years of faithful service, I wrote, I can no longer balance the demands of duty with the needs of my family. My children have sacrificed enough for my career. But 57 hostages were still being held, still depending on rescue coordination that required my specific expertise. I deleted the letter and focused on mission parameters, pushing thoughts of Jake's disappointed face out of my mind. The rescue operation was textbook perfect. We extracted all 57 hostages without casualties, dismantled the terrorist cell, and prevented what intelligence suggested could have been a wider plot against American diplomatic facilities throughout the region. The mission that had cost me my son's graduation had saved dozens of lives and prevented an international incident. I returned home 3 days later to find Jake's graduation program on the kitchen counter. My name conspicuously absent from the special thanks to parents section. Mrs. Henderson had attended in my place, had recorded the ceremony, had taken the photographs that should have been mine to capture. How was the graduation? I asked when Jake came downstairs, my voice carefully casual. Fine, he said, his tone flat and emotionless. I gave my speech, got my diploma. Mrs. Henderson said you had another emergency. Jake, I'm sorry. I know how important. Don't, he interrupted, his voice carrying a finality I'd never heard before. Just don't. I'm 18 now, Mom. I'm done pretending that your apologies mean anything. He sat across from me at the kitchen table where we'd shared midnight conversations about his future, where I'd helped him with homework on the rare evenings I was home, where we'd eaten countless silent dinners while I carried the weight of classified secrets. You want to know what I said in my graduation speech? He asked. I nodded, afraid to speak. I talked about how we all become who we are because of the people who show up for us. I talked about Mrs. Henderson, who came to every basketball game. I talked about my teachers, who stayed after school to help me with college applications. I talked about Emma, who drove me to practice when you were traveling. Each word was like a knife to my heart. Jake, I didn't mention you, he continued, his voice steady but cold. Because when I tried to think of times you'd shown up for me, really shown up, I couldn't come up with enough examples to fill a sentence. The silence that followed was deafening. 17 years of missed moments crystallized into this single devastating conversation. This moment, when my son finally voiced what we'd both known but never acknowledged. You're a stranger who lives in our house, he said quietly. You travel for work we're not allowed to understand. You make promises you never keep. And you expect us to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention you can spare between saving the world. My work matters, I said weakly, knowing the words sounded hollow. To who? Jake shot back. To the people you're protecting. Great, but what about the people you're supposed to protect first? What about your own children? I wanted to tell him about the hostages I'd just saved, about the terrorist attacks I'd prevented, about the wars that hadn't started because of operations he'd never know about. I wanted him to understand that his mother's sacrifices had meaning, that the price our family had paid was part of something larger, and more important than our personal happiness. But the classifications held, the secrets remained locked away, and my son continued to see me as a woman who chose strangers over family, duty over love, everything else over him. I'm going to Stanford in August, he said, standing up from the table. Emma's already on the East Coast. We'll both be gone, and you can travel as much as you want without disappointing anyone else. Jake, please, I love you, Mom, he said, and the past tense wasn't lost on me. But I can't keep hoping you'll change. I can't keep believing that someday I'll matter enough for you to choose me first. That night, I sat in my home office, staring at the resignation letter I'd drafted during the flight home. My children were essentially grown, both preparing to leave for college, both eager to build lives that didn't depend on a mother who'd proven herself unreliable. After 23 years of faithful service, I wrote again, I request permission to retire from active duty. My family has sacrificed enough for my career. But I didn't submit the letter. 57 families had their loved ones back because I'd missed Jake's graduation. Thousands of people were alive because I'd prioritized duty over motherhood for 2 decades. The math was brutal but undeniable. My personal failures as a mother had contributed to my professional success as a protector of innocent lives. Jake's graduation program sat on my desk, a reminder of everything I'd lost in service, to everything I'd saved. My son's name was printed in elegant script, marking his transition from childhood to adulthood. A milestone I'd missed while preventing other parents from losing their children to terrorism. The breaking point had finally arrived, and I realized with devastating clarity that it was already too late. My children were grown, their lives built around the assumption that their mother would always choose something else, someone else, somewhere else. The damage was done, the relationships permanently fractured by 23 years of choosing duty over family. The resignation letter remained unsent, filed away with all the other might-have-beens and what-ifs that defined my relationship with my children. I was Colonel Jasmine Maise, one of the most decorated intelligence officers in American history, and I was also a mother who had failed at the most important mission of her life. The briefing room in the Pentagon's most secure wing contained 12 of the most powerful people in American intelligence. But all eyes were focused on the classified folder sitting in front of my chair. The president himself had requested my presence for this meeting, a first in my 23-year career. Colonel Maise, the Director of National Intelligence, began, his voice carrying the weight of global implications. What you're about to hear is classified at the highest possible level. The success of this operation could prevent what analysts believe would be the most devastating terrorist attack in human history. The folder contained satellite imagery, intercepted communications, and intelligence reports that painted a picture of coordinated terror unlike anything we'd ever faced. Multiple cells across 3 continents, all working toward a single objective: the simultaneous detonation of dirty bombs in New York, London, and Paris during a global summit meeting that would include every major world leader. The window for prevention is closing rapidly, the CIA director added. Intelligence suggests the attacks are planned for September 3rd, exactly 3 weeks from today. September 3rd. Emma's college move-in day at Columbia. The date she'd circled on her calendar months ago. The fresh start she'd planned after years of disappointment and broken promises. The day I'd sworn would be different, when I'd finally prioritize being her mother over being a soldier. The operation requires deep infiltration of all 3 cells, the briefing continued. Coordination across multiple time zones, languages, and cultural contexts. Colonel Maise's unique skill set makes her irreplaceable for this mission. Irreplaceable. The word hung in the air like a death sentence for my relationship with Emma. How do you tell your daughter that her college send-off is less important than preventing World War III? How do you explain that helping her move into her dorm room matters less than stopping dirty bombs from irradiating 3 of the world's most important cities? The briefing included details that made my blood run cold. The terrorist network had been planning this coordinated attack for 5 years, recruiting from within established intelligence agencies, compromising security systems, positioning assets in locations that would maximize casualties and political chaos. If successful, the attacks would kill an estimated 50,000 people immediately and contaminate major population centers for decades. The psychological impact would be even more devastating than the immediate casualties, the terrorism expert explained. 3 simultaneous attacks on this scale would fundamentally alter global society, would make 9/11s look like a preliminary exercise. I studied the photos of the suspected terrorist faces I'd need to memorize, backgrounds I'd need to understand, personalities I'd need to manipulate. Each cell operated independently, unaware of the other's existence, connected only through a shadowy coordinator who went by the codename Phoenix. Colonel Maise, the president's representative, said, "Your mission is to infiltrate the coordination network, identify Phoenix, and provide real-time intelligence that will allow simultaneous strikes against all 3 cells. The timing must be perfect. If even one cell suspects compromise, they could accelerate their timeline or relocate their targets." The mission parameters were unlike anything I'd ever undertaken. 6 weeks of deep cover infiltration, posing as an arms dealer with terrorist sympathies, building relationships with people who planned to murder thousands of innocent civilians. The psychological toll would be immense, the physical danger constant, the margin for error non-existent. "What's the timeline for deployment?" I asked, already knowing the answer would destroy Emma's plans. 48 hours, came the reply. Intelligence indicates Phoenix will be making contact with cell leaders this weekend. Missing this window could mean losing our only chance to prevent the attacks. 48 hours. Emma and I were supposed to spend the weekend packing, shopping for dorm room supplies, having the mother-daughter conversations we'd never quite managed during her tumultuous teenage years. Instead, I'd be assuming a false identity and disappearing into a terrorist network that specialized in mass murder. The drive home from the Pentagon felt like a funeral procession. Every mile took me closer to another devastating conversation with Emma, another broken promise, another choice between duty and family that would leave permanent scars on our relationship. Emma was in her room when I arrived, surrounded by boxes and packing lists, her excitement about college palpable in the careful way she was organizing her belongings. She looked up when I appeared in her doorway, and I saw the exact moment she recognized my expression. "No," she said, her voice flat with exhaustion. "Whatever you're about to tell me, the answer is no. Emma, I need to talk to you about next weekend. We're moving me into Colombia," she said, her voice rising. "We planned this months ago. You promised me that nothing would interfere with my college send-off." How could I explain that the interference was a terrorist plot that threatened to change the course of human history? How could I tell her that preventing mass murder was more important than helping her hang posters in her dorm room? "There's been a development at work," I began, hating myself for the familiar phrase that had preceded so many disappointments. "Stop," Emma said, holding up her hand. "Just stop. I know what you're going to say, and I can't hear it again." She sat on her bed, surrounded by the detritus of childhood old photos, yearbooks, souvenirs from the normal teenage life she'd built despite having an absent mother. Her shoulders were shaking, and I realized she was crying. "You know what I told my roommate about you?" she asked through her tears. "I told her my mom was amazing, that she was going to help me move in, that we were finally going to have time to be normal together." "Emma, I'm 18 years old, and I've spent most of my life making excuses for you," she continued. "I've told teachers you were busy, friends you were important, boyfriends you were dedicated to your work. I've defended you to people who asked why you were never around." The pain in her voice was devastating. This was my child, the little girl, who used to wait by the window for me to come home from deployments, who used to save me drawings and school projects that I was too distracted to properly appreciate. "But I can't do it anymore," she said. "I can't keep pretending that your work is more important than your family. I can't keep believing that someday I'll matter enough for you to choose me first." "You do matter," I said desperately. "You matter more than anything." "Then don't go," she said, looking up at me with eyes that held 18 years of accumulated hurt. "If I really matter, if your family really comes first, then tell them to send someone else." The moment stretched between us, filled with the weight of an impossible choice. I could tell Emma about the dirty bombs, about the 50,000 people who would die if I didn't accept this mission. I could explain that her college send-off was a small sacrifice compared to preventing the collapse of international stability. But the classifications held, the secrets remained locked away. And my daughter continued to see me as a woman who consistently chose everything else over her own children. "I can't," I whispered. "I wish I could, but I can't." Emma nodded, her face hardening into an expression I'd never seen before. "I know. I've always known." The next morning, I packed for what I knew would be my final mission. 6 weeks of infiltrating terrorist networks, of pretending to support mass murder, of gathering intelligence that would save thousands of lives. The most important assignment of my career, and also the one that would finally sever the last threads connecting me to my daughter. Emma avoided me during my final day at home, communicating through notes left on the kitchen counter. "Good luck with your work. Hope it's worth it." The passive-aggressive tone was devastating in its restraint. Worse than screaming would have been. I left for the mission knowing that Emma would move into Colombia without me, would begin her adult life, with the understanding that her mother had chosen duty over love one final time. The terrorist plot was real, the stakes enormous, the need for my expertise undeniable. But as I assumed my false identity, and began infiltrating a network that planned to murder 50,000 innocent people, I carried with me the knowledge that saving strangers had cost me my own daughter, that preventing one kind of devastation had caused another kind altogether. The mission was successful. Phoenix was identified and eliminated. All 3 terrorist cells were neutralized, and the coordinated attacks were prevented. 50,000 people lived because I missed Emma's college send-off. Because I chose duty over family one last time. When I returned home 6 weeks later, Emma's room was empty. She'd moved into her dorm, started her new life, begun building an identity that didn't include an absent mother. The house felt hollow, abandoned. A monument to 23 years of choosing service over family. That night, I wrote my final resignation letter, after 23 years of faithful service. I hereby request immediate retirement from active duty. My mission is complete. The mission wasn't preventing terrorist attacks or dismantling criminal networks or protecting American interests abroad. My mission was being a mother, and I'd failed at it completely. Emma and Jake were grown, independent, building lives that didn't require or expect my presence. It was time to face the hardest truth of my career. I'd been so busy saving other people's families that I'd lost my own. The retirement paperwork felt heavier than any classified document I'd ever carried. 23 years of service reduced to forms and signatures, medical evaluations, and pension calculations. I sat in my home office on a Tuesday morning, filling out sections that asked about my plans for civilian life, future employment prospects, health insurance needs, practical questions that assumed I had a life waiting beyond the classified world I'd inhabited for over 2 decades. Reason for retirement, the form prompted, offering multiple choice options: health concerns, family obligations, career change, completion of service, commitment. None of the boxers captured the real reason. My children were strangers, my family was broken, and I'd finally realized that saving the world meant nothing if you lost your own soul in the process. I checked family obligations and moved to the next section. Emma had been at Columbia for 3 weeks, and our phone conversations had become exercises in polite distance. She'd tell me about her classes, her roommate, her excitement about campus life, but always with the careful tone of someone talking to an acquaintance rather than her mother. "How's the adjustment to college life?" I'd ask during our weekly calls. "Good," she'd reply. "Really good. I love having independence." The word independence always carried extra weight when Emma said it. A reminder that she'd learned self-sufficiency as a survival mechanism, that she'd built a life that didn't require my presence or participation. Jake was in his first semester at Stanford, throwing himself into his studies with the same determined focus that had characterized his entire high school experience. His calls were even more perfunctory than Emma's brief check-ins. That felt more like obligation than genuine desire to connect. "How are your classes?" I'd ask. "Great, really challenging. I love it here." "Are you making friends?" "Yeah, my roommate's cool. Everyone's really smart." Each conversation lasted exactly 10 minutes, just long enough to fulfill filial duty, but not long enough to risk genuine emotional connection. Both of my children had learned to protect themselves from disappointment by expecting nothing and maintaining distance. The retirement checklist was extensive: security clearance termination, classified material return, debriefing sessions with multiple agencies. 23 years of secrets had to be properly cataloged and secured. 23 years of contacts and operations had to be documented for future reference. But the most challenging part of retirement planning was imagining a life without the structure that had defined my adult existence. What does a former intelligence officer do with her days? How do you transition from protecting national security to worrying about grocery lists and dental appointments? Mrs. Henderson had been instrumental in helping me think through the practical aspects of civilian life. She'd become my closest confidant over the years, the one person who'd witnessed the daily reality of my impossible balancing act. "Have you thought about what you want to do next?" she asked one afternoon while we drank coffee in my kitchen. "I honestly have no idea," I admitted. For 23 years, my life has been defined by classified missions and national security. I don't know how to be just Jasmine Maise, civilian. "Maybe that's the point," she said gently. "Maybe it's time to figure out who you are when you're not saving the world." The comment was meant to be supportive, but it highlighted the fundamental problem with my retirement plans. I'd never learned to be anything other than a soldier, a spy, a protector of strangers. The skills that had made me invaluable to my country, the ability to compartmentalize emotion, to prioritize mission over personal needs, to carry secrets without sharing the burden, were exactly the skills that had destroyed my relationship with my children. I'd saved thousands of lives over the course of my career, but I'd never learned how to be present for the 2 lives that mattered most. I'd prevented international incidents, but I'd caused a family crisis that would take years to repair, if it could be repaired at all. The financial aspects of retirement were straightforward: military pension, healthcare benefits, Social Security. After 23 years of government service, I was financially secure enough to focus on rebuilding rather than surviving. But how do you rebuild relationships that had been neglected for 2 decades? How do you become a mother to children who'd learned to live without one? I spent hours researching Civilian careers that might provide meaning without requiring the total commitment that had characterized my military service. Teaching, perhaps sharing my language skills and cultural knowledge with students who might benefit from my experience. Consulting work with security firms that needed someone with my background but could offer regular hours and predictable schedules. But every career option felt hollow compared to the life and death stakes I'd grown accustomed to. How do you find purpose in normal work when you've spent decades preventing wars and saving lives? How do you care about quarterly reports when you're used to intelligence briefings that shape international policy? The psychological evaluation required for retirement was particularly challenging. The military psychiatrist asked questions designed to assess my readiness for civilian life, my emotional stability, my ability to cope with the transition from active duty to retirement. Do you have family support for this transition? She asked. My children are both in college, I said, which wasn't really an answer to her question. How would you describe your relationship with your children? I sat in silence for a long moment, trying to find words that wouldn't reveal the full extent of my failure as a mother. Complicated, I said finally. They're both very independent. Many military families struggle with reintegration, she said kindly. The demands of service can create distance that takes time to bridge. Distance, such a clinical word for the chasm that separated me from Emma and Jake. Such a gentle way to describe the fundamental breakdown of trust that had occurred over 23 years of choosing duty over family. The hardest part of retirement planning was accepting that some damage might be permanent. Emma and Jake had built lives that functioned without my involvement, had developed coping mechanisms that assumed my absence rather than my presence. They'd learned not to need me. And maybe that lesson couldn't be unlearned. But retirement also offered something I'd never had before: time. Time to visit Emma at Columbia, to attend Jake's Stanford events, to rebuild relationships that had been neglected but not necessarily destroyed. Time to prove that I could be present, reliable, worthy of their trust. The resignation letter I'd drafted and redrafted dozens of times finally felt ready to submit. After 23 years of faithful service, I wrote, I hereby request retirement from active duty effective immediately. I am grateful for the opportunity to have served my country, but I am now ready to serve my family. Serving my family. The phrase felt foreign, almost revolutionary, after 2 decades of prioritizing everyone else's families over my own. But maybe it wasn't too late. Maybe retirement could be the beginning of a different kind of mission, one focused on healing, rather than protecting, on building rather than preventing, on being present rather than absent. I submitted the paperwork on a Friday morning and spent the weekend imagining a life without encrypted phones and classified briefings, without midnight deployments and mission deadlines. A life where my biggest concern might be whether Emma was eating enough vegetables at college, whether Jake was managing his course load, whether my children might someday see me as something more than the woman who'd chosen to save everyone, except them. The retirement approval came through in 2 weeks faster than I'd expected, suggesting that my superiors understood the personal cost of my service and supported my decision to prioritize family for once. Colonel Jasmine Maise would officially become Ms. Jasmine Maise on December 1st. Exactly 1 month before my 43rd birthday, for the first time in 23 years. I wouldn't be spending my birthday on a classified mission or in a secure briefing room. I'd be a civilian, a retiree, a mother trying to figure out how to be present for children who'd learned to live without her presence. The retirement planning was almost complete, but the real work, the work of rebuilding a family that had been fractured by duty and secrecy, was just beginning. The black sedan pulled into my driveway at exactly 10 a.m. on a Saturday morning. Its tinted windows and government plates immediately recognizable to anyone who'd spent decades in the intelligence community. I was in my garden, attempting to plant tulip bulbs for the spring I'd actually be home to see, when the distinctive rumble of the Crown Victoria's engine made me look up. My blood ran cold. Official visits to retired personnel were rare and usually meant one of 2 things: either there was a crisis requiring my expertise, or there was a security issue with my retirement. Neither possibility filled me with confidence. General Patricia Hawkins stepped out of the passenger side, her dress uniform immaculate despite the casual Saturday morning timing. I'd worked with her on 3 separate operations, but never in a social context, never at my suburban home where the classified world wasn't supposed to intrude. General Hawkins, I said, standing up and brushing dirt from my jeans. This is unexpected. Colonel Maise, she said, then corrected herself with a slight smile. I apologize. Ms. Maise, may we come in? The "we" included 2 other officers I didn't immediately recognize, both carrying themselves with the bearing of senior military personnel. Official visits of this magnitude didn't happen for routine retirement paperwork or security debriefings. Emma's car was in the driveway. She'd driven home from Colombia for the weekend. Our first real time together since she'd started college. We'd planned to spend the day shopping for winter clothes and maybe having the kind of normal mother-daughter conversation that had eluded us for years. "Of course," I said, leading them toward the house. "Can I ask what this is about?" "It's a rather unusual situation," General Hawkins said diplomatically. "Better discussed inside." Emma was in the kitchen when we entered, wearing pajama pants and an oversized Columbia sweatshirt, her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She looked up from her bowl of cereal with the particular expression teenagers reserve for unexpected, adult intrusions. "Emma," I said, "this is General Hawkins and some colleagues from my former workplace. They need to discuss some business matters." Emma's eyes widened slightly as she took in the uniforms, the medals, the obvious importance of the visitors. Former workplace had always been my euphemism for the intelligence community, but seeing high-ranking military officers in our kitchen made the reality more concrete. "Should I leave?" Emma asked, already standing to give us privacy. "Actually," General Hawkins said, her tone shifting to something warmer, more personal, "this concerns you as well. Both you and your brother, though I understand he's at Stanford." Emma looked confused, and I felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in my stomach. Whatever this was about, it was significant enough to warrant a weekend visit from the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, important enough to involve my children directly. "Please, everyone sit," I said, gesturing toward the living room. "Can I get anyone coffee?" "This won't take long," General Hawkins said, settling into the armchair that David used to occupy during happier times. "Ms. Maise, we're here because of a rather extraordinary situation that's developed since your retirement." She opened her briefcase and withdrew a thick folder marked with classification stamps I recognized. 3 weeks ago, intelligence agencies from 12 allied nations submitted a joint commendation regarding Operation Phoenix, your final mission before retirement. Emma was listening intently, her confusion evident. She'd never heard me discuss specific operations, had never been exposed to the details of my professional life beyond vague references to government work. "The intelligence you provided during your infiltration of the terrorist network," General Hawkins continued, "didn't just prevent the planned attacks on New York, London, and Paris. Your work led to the dismantling of an entire international network that had been operating for over a decade." The folder contained documents I'd never seen, damage assessments, intelligence reports, photographs of weapons caches, and safe houses that had been raided based on information I'd provided during those 6 weeks of deep cover operation. 47 terrorist cells across 6 continents, one of the accompanying officers said. Over 200 arrests, including several high-value targets who'd been evading capture for years. The network you helped expose was responsible for 17 major attacks over the past 5 years. Emma was staring at me with an expression I'd never seen before, not confusion or resentment, but something approaching awe. The woman she'd dismissed as a boring government employee was being described as someone who'd dismantled international terrorist networks. "The Joint Chiefs from all NATO nations," General Hawkins continued, "along with intelligence directors from allied countries, have recommended you for the highest civilian honors available. The President has approved the recommendations." She withdrew another document from the folder. "Ms. Maise, you're being awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom, the highest civilian honor in the United States. Additionally, you'll receive comparable honors from the United Kingdom, France, Germany, and 6 other allied nations." The words seemed to echo in my quiet suburban living room. Presidential Medal of Freedom. The same award given to civil rights leaders, Nobel Prize winners, individuals whose contributions had shaped the course of human history. "I don't understand," I said, genuinely bewildered. "Why now? Why a public ceremony?" "My work was classified." "Because," General Hawkins said, "the scope of what you accomplished has become impossible to ignore. Your final operation didn't just prevent 3 terrorist attacks, it ended a network that posed an existential threat to international security." Emma had gone completely silent, her cereal forgotten, her attention focused entirely on the conversation unfolding in our living room. For 18 years, she'd seen me as an absent mother whose work was less important than her family. Now she was hearing that her mother had received the highest civilian honor in the country. "The ceremony," General Hawkins continued, will be held at the White House next month. It's a public event, with full media coverage. The classification restrictions on your recent operations have been lifted to allow for appropriate recognition. Public, I asked, feeling panic rise in my chest. But my children, your children? General Hawkins said gently, will finally understand what their mother has been doing for the past 23 years. I looked at Emma, whose face was cycling through emotions I couldn't entirely read. Shock, certainly. Confusion, definitely, but also something that might have been pride, or anger, or a complex mixture of both. Mom, Emma said quietly, what were you actually doing all those times you traveled for work? The question I'd been dreading for 18 years, asked in the presence of military officials who'd just revealed more about my career than I'd ever been able to share with my own daughter. Preventing bad things from happening to good people, I said. The same inadequate explanation I'd been giving for years, but now backed by official recognition that made it impossible to dismiss. The President, General Hawkins added, specifically, requested that your family be present for the ceremony. He wants to personally thank them for the sacrifices they've made to support your service. Emma laughed, but there was no humor in it. Sacrifices we made. We didn't even know what we were sacrificing for. The room fell silent. General Hawkins exchanged glances with her colleagues, clearly uncomfortable with the family tension she'd inadvertently exposed. Emma, I started, but she held up her hand. No, let me understand this, she said, her voice rising slightly. All those times you missed my recitals, Jake's games, our birthdays, you were preventing terrorist attacks. You were saving thousands of lives. Yes, I said simply, because there was no other answer, and you couldn't tell us. Not even a hint that your work actually mattered. General Hawkins cleared her throat diplomatically. The classification levels required for your mother's operations prohibited any discussion of her activities. Even acknowledging her specific role could have compromised ongoing operations and endangered lives. Emma turned her attention to the general. So my mother is actually a hero. Not just a government bureaucrat who cared more about paperwork than her own children. Your mother, General Hawkins said firmly, is one of the most decorated intelligence officers in American history. Her service record includes commendations for valor, multiple successful operations that prevented international incidents, and a level of personal sacrifice that few people could sustain. I watched Emma process this information, saw the exact moment when 18 years of resentment collided with the reality of what my absences had actually meant. Her expression shifted from anger to confusion to something that might have been grief. The car outside, one of the other officers said, attempting to lighten the mood, is actually for ceremonial purposes. We wanted to arrive in a manner befitting the occasion. Emma looked out the window at the government sedan, then back at me. How long? She asked. How long? What? How long have you been doing this? The real work, not the cover story. 20 years, I said. Since before you were born. So my entire life, she said slowly. You've been lying to me about who you are. Not lying, I said desperately. Protecting. Everything I couldn't tell you was to keep you safe, to keep you from worrying, to let you have normal lives. Normal lives. Emma's voice cracked. You think we had normal lives? You think growing up with a mother who was never there, who couldn't explain why she was always somewhere else, who made us feel like we weren't important enough to come first, you think that was normal? General Hawkins stood up, recognizing that this family conversation needed privacy. Perhaps we should leave you to discuss this privately. The ceremony details can be worked out later. No, Emma said quickly. I want to hear this. I want to understand what was so important that my mother missed 18 years of my life. General Hawkins sat back down, clearly uncomfortable but recognizing Emma's need for answers. Your mother's work saved lives on a scale that's difficult to comprehend. The terrorist network she dismantled in her final operation alone was planning attacks that could have killed over 50,000 people. 50,000, Emma repeated numbly. People who get to go home to their families because my mom wasn't at my high school graduation. That's a difficult way to look at it, General Hawkins said gently, but not entirely inaccurate. Emma stood up abruptly and walked to the window, staring out at the quiet suburban street where children rode bicycles and families washed cars and life proceeded with the peaceful normalcy that my work had helped preserve. I need to call Jake, she said without turning around. He needs to hear this. Emma, I said, maybe we should talk first, just us. Talk about what? She asked, finally turning to face me. About how you've been a hero this whole time and I've been angry at you for saving the world. About how every missed birthday was actually preventing mass murder. About how I've spent my entire life misunderstanding my own mother. The pain in her voice was devastating. I'd thought the worst consequence of my secrecy was my children's resentment. I'd never considered that the truth might be even more painful, that understanding the stakes of my work might make them feel guilty for wanting their mother present. Might make them question whether their own needs had any validity compared to the lives I was saving. Your feelings are valid, I said quietly. You had every right to want your mother at your graduation, at your recitals, at your birthday parties. The fact that I was preventing tragedies doesn't diminish your right to have a mother who was present and available. But it changes everything, Emma said, tears starting to flow. It changes how I understand my entire childhood. It changes whether I'm allowed to be angry, whether my hurt feelings matter when weighed against thousands of lives. General Hawkins leaned forward. If I may, she said, your mother's choice to pursue this career, to accept these responsibilities, was hers alone. You're allowed to have complicated feelings about the consequences of that choice, even when the choice was noble. Emma wiped her eyes and looked directly at me. I'm proud of you, she said, and the words hit me like a physical blow. I'm proud that my mother saved all those people, that you were brave enough and skilled enough to do what needed to be done. But, I prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification in her voice. But I'm also angry that I spent 18 years feeling abandoned by someone who is actually a hero. I'm angry that you couldn't find a way to make me understand that your absences had meaning. I'm angry that I had to learn who my mother really was from strangers in my living room. The government sedan in my driveway had brought more than official recognition. It had brought the collision of two worlds I'd kept carefully separate for over 2 decades. My children were finally learning who their mother really was, but the revelation was creating as much pain as it was resolving. The ceremony, General Hawkins said carefully, will provide an opportunity for public recognition of your mother's service. It might also provide closure for your family, a chance to understand the full scope of her contributions to your security and the security of millions of others. Emma looked at me with eyes that held too much knowledge for someone who'd just turned 18. Will you be there? She asked. At the ceremony? Of course, I said. Promise? She asked, and the word carried the weight of 18 years of broken promises. 18 years of emergencies that had taken me away from the moments that mattered to her. I promise, I said, knowing that this time, nothing could interfere. My career was over, my service complete, my final mission accomplished. This ceremony would mark the end of my classified life and perhaps the beginning of my attempt to be the mother my children had always deserved. The government sedan represented everything that had separated me from my family, but it also carried the truth that might finally help us understand each other. After 23 years of secrets, my children were about to discover that their absent mother had been fighting battles they'd never imagined, protecting freedoms they'd taken for granted, saving lives they'd never know about. It wasn't redemption, exactly, but it was revelation. And maybe, for a family that had been broken by duty and secrecy, revelation was the first step toward healing. The file folder General Hawkins left behind was 3 inches thick, filled with declassified documents. That painted a picture of my career I'd never been able to share. After the officials departed, Emma and I sat at the kitchen table where we'd shared countless silent dinners. And I opened the folder for the first time, seeing my own service record from the outside perspective. Look at this, Emma said, picking up a photograph from Operation Silent Guardian. It showed the Kosovo compound after the rescue, with smoke rising from buildings and medical personnel treating the refugees I'd helped evacuate. This was when you were in the hospital for 3 months, wasn't it? When you told us you fell down stairs at work. I nodded, remembering how 9-year-old Emma had brought me drawings in the hospital. How she'd asked why mommy couldn't come to her school play. How I'd made up stories about clumsy accidents and workplace injuries. 17 people, she read from the mission summary. You saved 17 refugees and 3 American aid workers. And I was angry that you missed my science fair. You had every right to be angry, I said, but Emma was already moving to the next document. Operation Nightfall, she read aloud. Duration, 3 months. Outcome, prevented coordinated subway attacks in 3 major cities. Estimated lives saved, 2,000 to 3,000. She looked up at me with wide eyes. This was during my senior year, when you were working those crazy hours and I thought you were just being a workaholic. Each document revealed another layer of the double life I'd been living. the arms trafficking network I'd dismantled while Emma was applying to colleges, the chemical weapons facility I'd helped destroy while Jake was learning to drive, the terrorist financing operation I'd exposed while my children were navigating teenage heartbreak and academic pressure. There are dozens of these, Emma said, flipping through mission summaries that spanned her entire childhood. Dozens of operations where you saved hundreds or thousands of lives, and missed hundreds of moments with you and Jake, I added, because the heroism documented in the files didn't erase the birthdays I'd skipped, the recitals I'd attended via Mrs. Henderson's video recordings, the bedtime stories that had been cut short by encrypted phone calls. Emma picked up a newspaper, clipping from the Washington Post, the same article I'd read in my car outside her high school, the sanitized version of Operation Nightfall that mentioned federal law enforcement, but nothing about the intelligence officer who'd spent 3 months infiltrating a terrorist cell. You were sitting in terrorist meetings while I was complaining about algebra homework, she said, her voice filled with a mixture of awe and disbelief. Sometimes, I admitted, and sometimes I was thinking about your algebra homework while sitting in terrorist meetings. She found a commendation letter from the Director of National Intelligence, written after I'd prevented a bombing at a children's hospital in Eastern Europe. The letter was dated 2 days before Jake's 13th birthday party, the one where I'd arrived 3 hours late, still exhausted from 48 hours of non-stop operations. A children's hospital, Emma said quietly. You were saving children I'd never meet while Jake was wondering why his mother didn't care enough to be on time for his birthday. I cared, I said, my voice breaking. I always cared. That was the problem, I cared about everything. Your birthday mattered to me, and those children mattered to me, and I never learned how to choose between them. Emma continued reading, her expression growing more complex with each document. A photograph from Operation Blackwater showed the rescued embassy personnel, 57 Americans who'd returned home to their families because I'd missed Jake's graduation. A mission report from my final assignment detailed the international terrorist network that had been dismantled, the 50,000 lives that had been saved, the global catastrophe that had been prevented while Emma was moving into her Columbia dorm room alone. How did you carry all this? She asked finally. How did you live with knowing that every family dinner, every school event, every normal moment was happening because you'd prevented something terrible from happening to someone else's family? Some days I didn't think about it, I said honestly. Some days I just focused on being your mother, on helping with homework and making dinner and pretending that my biggest concern was whether you'd cleaned your room. And other days I felt like I was going to break under the weight of it all. Emma found a photograph that made her gasp, a picture of me receiving a classified commendation from the president, taken in the Oval Office after Operation Phoenix. I was in dress uniform, standing next to the commander-in-chief, receiving recognition for preventing what intelligence analysts called the most significant terrorist threat in American history. You met the president, she said. Several times, actually. Different presidents, different operations. And you never told us. You came home from meeting the President of the United States and helped me with my history homework like it was just another day at the office. Because it was just another day, I said. The president was just another part of the job. You were my life. Emma looked up from the files, her eyes filled with tears. But we didn't feel like your life. We felt like an afterthought, like something you fitted in between the important stuff. The truth of her words was devastating. I'd tried so hard to compartmentalize, to keep my children safe from the realities of my work, that I'd made them feel insignificant by comparison. They'd grown up believing they were less important than my boring government job, never knowing that their mother was preventing wars, saving lives, shaping the course of international relations. There's something else, I said, reaching for the folder. I pulled out the resignation letter I'd drafted after Jake's graduation, the one I'd never submitted. I almost quit after I missed Jake's graduation. I wrote this letter requesting immediate retirement because I couldn't stand choosing duty over family one more time. Emma read the letter, her expression softening. But you didn't submit it. The Phoenix operation came up. 50,000 lives, hanging in the balance. I couldn't walk away from that, even for Jake's graduation. So you chose to save 50,000 strangers instead of watching your son graduate? Yes, I said simply. Because there was no other way to put it. Emma was quiet for a long time, processing the impossible mathematics of my career, lives saved versus moments missed. Global security versus family stability, duty to country versus duty to children. I need to call Jake, she said finally. He needs to see these files, needs to understand what you were actually doing all those times we thought you were choosing work over family. She reached for her phone, then paused. Mom, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you regret it? The career, the missions, the sacrifices. If you could do it all over again, would you choose differently? It was the question I'd been asking myself since retirement. The impossible choice between the woman I'd been as a soldier and the woman I'd failed to be as a mother. I regret the pain I caused you and Jake, I said carefully. I regret that. You grew up feeling abandoned and unimportant. I regret that I couldn't find a way to be both the mother you deserved and the officer my country needed. But the work itself. I looked at the photographs of rescued hostages. The mission reports that detailed prevented attacks. The commendation letters that represented thousands of lives saved over 23 years of service. No, I said quietly. I don't regret the work. Those people deserved to live, deserved to go home to their families, deserved to be protected from evil they never saw coming. I just wish I could have saved them without losing so much of my relationship with you and Jake. Emma nodded, understanding the complexity of a choice that had no perfect answer. Jake's going to want to see all of this, she said, gesturing to the files. He's going to want to understand why you missed his graduation, why it was worth missing. Will he forgive me? I asked, the question that had been haunting me since his bitter words after the ceremony I'd skipped. I don't know, Emma said honestly. But now he'll at least understand what he's being asked to forgive. The classified file folder represented 23 years of secrets finally revealed. 23 years of heroism that my children had never been allowed to see. It didn't erase the damage that had been done, didn't automatically heal relationships that had been fractured by duty and secrecy, but it provided context, understanding, a foundation for forgiveness that hadn't existed when my children believed their mother simply cared more about paperwork than family. Now they knew the truth. Their mother had cared so much about protecting families that she'd sacrificed her own in the process. The question was whether understanding would be enough to rebuild what duty had torn apart. Jake flew home from Stanford the morning of the White House ceremony, arriving with the same carefully controlled expression he'd worn since his graduation day, but something had shifted during his red-eye flight. Emma had spent hours on the phone with him the night before, walking him through the declassified files, explaining the scope of what our mother had actually been doing during all those missed milestones. I picked him up at the airport at 6 a.m., both of us exhausted but needing this time together before the formal ceremony that would publicly recognize what I'd been unable to privately share for 18 years. So you really prevented a nuclear attack? He asked as we drove through the quiet morning streets. A dirty bomb attack, I corrected. Different technology, but yes. 3 cities, coordinated timing, potentially catastrophic casualties. While I was starting freshman year at Stanford. While you were starting freshman year at Stanford, we drove in silence for several miles, both of us processing the weight of that revelation. Jake's college orientation had coincided with my final mission, the operation that had cost me my relationship with Emma but had saved tens of thousands of lives. I've been angry at you for 18 years, he said finally. You had every right to be angry. But I was angry about the wrong things, he continued. I thought you were choosing meaningless work over important family moments. I didn't know you were choosing other people's families over ours. The choice was real either way, I said. I still missed your graduation. I still wasn't there when you needed me. But the reason matters, Jake said quietly. The reason changes everything. When we arrived home, Emma was waiting with Mrs. Henderson, who had agreed to attend the ceremony as part of our extended family. Over the years, she'd become more than a neighbor. She'd been the consistent adult presence in my children's lives. The woman who'd attended their events when I couldn't, who'd provided stability when my duty demanded chaos. Mrs. Henderson should get a medal too, Emma said, hugging the woman who'd essentially raised my children. She's the one who made sure we didn't completely fall apart while you were saving the world. Mrs. Henderson smiled, her eyes filling with tears. Your mother's work mattered, she said, but so did you children. I was honored to help bridge that gap. The drive to Washington was quiet, each of us lost in our own thoughts about the ceremony ahead. For 23 years, my service had been invisible, classified, known only to a small circle of government officials and intelligence professionals. Today, it would be acknowledged publicly, with media coverage and formal recognition that would fundamentally change how the world and my children understood my life. The White House was more impressive than any photograph could convey, its weight of history palpable as we passed through security checkpoints and metal detectors. Emma and Jake stayed close to me, both of them overwhelmed by the significance of the setting. "I can't believe my mom is getting a medal from the president," Jake whispered as we were escorted to the East Room. "I can't believe any of this is real," Emma added. The ceremony itself was formal, dignified, filled with military protocol and diplomatic language that spoke to the international scope of my final operation. Representatives from 12 allied nations were present. Each country's highest-ranking officials gathered to recognize work that had protected not just American lives but global security. When the president called my name, when I stepped forward to receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom, I caught sight of Emma and Jake in the audience. For the first time in years, they were looking at me with something that might have been pride rather than disappointment. "Colonel Jasmine Maise," the president said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "your service to this nation and to our allies represents the highest ideals of courage, sacrifice, and dedication to the protection of innocent life. Your work has prevented immeasurable tragedy and preserved the security that allows families across the globe to sleep safely in their homes." The medal was heavier than I'd expected, its weight symbolic of the responsibility I'd carried for over 2 decades. But as I looked out at the audience, as I saw my children watching their mother receive the nation's highest civilian honor, I realized that the heaviest burden I'd carried wasn't the classified secrets or the life-and-death decisions, it was the knowledge that the people I loved most had never understood the price I'd paid to protect them. After the ceremony, during the reception where diplomats and intelligence officials mingled with champagne and formal conversation, Emma and Jake stayed close to my side. They seemed to be seeing me differently, not just as their absent mother but as someone who commanded respect from the most powerful people in the world. "Ambassador Chen," I said, introducing my children to the Chinese representative. "These are my children, Emma and Jake. Your mother," Ambassador Chen said to them, "prevented what our intelligence services believe would have been the beginning of a new era of international terrorism. Her work has made the world safer for your generation." Similar conversations happened throughout the reception. Foreign ministers and intelligence directors approached to thank me for my service, each adding context that helped Emma and Jake understand the scope of what their mother had accomplished. "Your mother's linguistic abilities," the French ambassador told Emma, allowed her to infiltrate networks that had been operating undetected for years. "She speaks our language better than many French citizens." "Your mother's strategic thinking," the German intelligence director told Jake, prevented what could have escalated into open warfare between allied nations and terrorist organizations. Each comment was another piece of the puzzle that my children had never been allowed to see, another element of their mother's life that had been hidden behind classifications and cover stories. But the most significant moment came when we returned home that evening, exhausted from the ceremony but finally able to talk openly about my career for the first time in their lives. "I have questions," Jake said, settling into the living room where this revelation had begun with General Hawkins' surprise visit. "I have answers," I said. "Finally, when you missed my science fair in 7th grade, Emma began, "what were you actually doing?" "Preventing a chemical weapons attack on a school in Eastern Europe," I said. 300 children who went home safely that day because we stopped the attack before it happened. "And my championship basketball game. Disrupting an arms trafficking network that was supplying weapons to terrorist cells across North Africa." We spent hours going through their memories, matching the moments I'd missed with the operations that had required my absence. Each missed event had corresponded to lives saved. Each broken promise had prevented someone else's family from being destroyed. "I understand now why you couldn't tell us," Emma said finally. "But I still wish there had been some way to make us feel like we mattered too." "You mattered most," I said. "You always mattered most. That's why I did the work to protect the world you were growing up in, to make sure you could have normal lives without fear." "But we didn't have normal lives," Jake pointed out. "We had lives where our mother was never present, where we learned not to count on you for anything important." "I know," I said. "And that's my biggest regret, not that I did the work, but that I couldn't find a way to do it without making you feel abandoned." Emma reached across the space between us and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," she said. "I'm proud that my mother saved all those people, that you were brave enough to carry those secrets, that you sacrificed so much for strangers you'd never meet." "But," I prompted, hearing the unspoken qualification, "but I'm also sad for the childhood I might have had if you'd been just a normal mom with a normal job." "I'm sad for that too," I admitted. I'm sad for the recitals I missed, the games I skipped, the conversations we never had because I was always somewhere else. Jake leaned forward. So what happens now? You're retired. The secrets are out. We, finally, understand what you were doing. What happens to us as a family? It was the question that had been haunting me since retirement, the challenge of rebuilding relationships that had been fractured by duty and secrecy. I don't know, I said, honestly. I've spent 23 years being a soldier, a spy, a protector of strangers. I've never learned how to just be your mother. Maybe that's what we figure out together, Emma said. Maybe we learn how to be a family when duty isn't pulling you in different directions. The medal from the White House ceremony sat on our coffee table, catching the lamplight, a tangible symbol of recognition that had been 23 years in the making. But the real ceremony was happening in our living room, where my children were finally understanding their mother's life, and I was finally able to share the truth that had separated us for so long. Reconciliation wouldn't happen overnight. Trust, that had been broken over decades, wouldn't be rebuilt in a single conversation. But understanding was a beginning, and for the first time in years, I allowed myself to hope that my family might be repairable, that love might be stronger than duty, that the woman who'd saved so many strangers might finally learn how to be present for the people who'd loved her despite her absence. The family photo from that evening shows 3 people who were learning to see each other clearly for the first time. Emma and Jake, finally understanding that their mother's absence had meaning beyond their comprehension. And me, finally able to be honest about the weight I'd carried. The choices I'd made. The price we'd all paid for my service to something larger than ourselves. It wasn't redemption, exactly, but it was recognition, understanding, and the beginning of whatever came next for a family that had been broken by duty and was now attempting to heal through truth. 6 months after the White House ceremony, I stood in Jake's Stanford dorm room, helping him hang posters and arrange furniture like any normal mother might do for her college-aged son. The difference was that we both understood the significance of my presence, not just as an available parent, but as someone who had chosen family over duty for the first time in 23 years. This is weird, Jake said, stepping back to admire the Stanford pennant we'd just mounted above his desk. Good, weird or bad weird? I asked. Good weird, he said with a smile that reminded me of the boy he'd been before duty and secrecy had complicated our relationship. I've never had help decorating anything before. Mrs. Henderson was great, but she wasn't really a decorator. The retirement shadow box sat prominently on his bookshelf, a display case containing my medals, rank insignia, and photos from various operations. Jake had insisted on having it in his room, a visible reminder of his mother's service that he'd never been allowed to acknowledge before. My roommate thinks it's pretty cool, he said, adjusting the case slightly. Having a mom who's basically a real-life spy. I was never technically a spy, I corrected, the same clarification I'd been making since the story became public. Intelligence officer, counterterrorism specialist, but not a spy. Whatever, Jake said, grinning. You infiltrated terrorist networks and prevented international incidents. That's spy stuff. Emma had returned to Columbia for her sophomore year with a new understanding of her family history and a pride she'd never been able to feel before. She'd joined the International Relations Club and was considering a major in diplomatic studies. Inspired by her mother's career, in ways she was still processing. I might want to work in intelligence someday, she'd told me during one of our no regular phone calls. Not the same way you did. I don't think I could handle the sacrifices you made, but maybe something that contributes to global security. The idea of Emma following in my footsteps was both thrilling and terrifying. I wanted her to serve, if that's what called to her, but I also wanted her to learn from my mistakes. To find ways to serve without sacrificing family. To build a life that didn't require the kind of compartmentalization that had nearly destroyed our relationships. My civilian life was still taking shape. I'd started teaching a graduate course in international security at Georgetown University, sharing my expertise in ways that didn't require classified briefings or overseas deployments. The students were eager, intelligent, hungry for real-world knowledge that only someone with my background could provide. Professor Mattia, one student had asked after a lecture on counterterrorism strategies, what was it like carrying all those secrets for so long? Lonely, I'd answered honestly. The hardest part wasn't the danger or the responsibility, was the isolation that came from living a life you couldn't share with the people you loved most. The question had sparked a broader discussion about the personal costs of public service, about the sacrifices made by military families, about the weight carried by people who protect society from threats most citizens never see coming. These conversations with young people who might someday face similar choices felt meaningful in ways that complemented but didn't replace the satisfaction I'd found in operational work. Mrs. Henderson had become an official part of our family narrative, rather than just a helpful neighbor. At our first Thanksgiving together since the revelations, I'd insisted she join us as the woman who'd held our family together during my decades of absence. "You raised my children when I couldn't," I'd said during my toast. "You gave them stability and consistency in love when their mother was protecting strangers. You deserve recognition for that service." Emma and Jake had nodded emphatically, both of them understanding now that Mrs. Henderson's role had been essential, that their childhood stability had depended on her willingness to step in when duty called me away. The hardest part of civilian life was learning to live without the constant urgency that had defined my career. No more encrypted phones buzzing with mission alerts, no more classified briefings that required immediate deployment, no more life and death decisions that affected international security. The quiet of retirement was peaceful but also disorienting after decades of high-stakes operations. "Do you miss it?" Emma asked during one of her visits home from Colombia. "Parts of it," I admitted. "I miss feeling essential, knowing that my work directly prevented harm to innocent people. I miss the intellectual challenge, the adrenaline, the sense of purpose that came from protecting something larger than myself, but not enough to go back." "No," I said firmly. "I spent 23 years choosing duty over family. Now I want to spend whatever years I have left learning how to be present for the people I love." The teaching position provided a bridge between my old life and my new one, allowing me to contribute to national security through education rather than operations. My students would become the next generation of intelligence officers, diplomats, and policymakers. Training them felt like a different kind of service, one that honored my experience while allowing me to maintain the family connections I'd worked so hard to rebuild. Jake had started calling regularly, our conversations ranging from academic challenges to relationship advice to his own career plans. The ease of our communication was something I'd never expected to recover, a gift that came from finally being able to be honest about who I was and what I'd done. "I understand now why you made the choices you did," he'd said during one late-night phone call. "I understand that you were trying to protect everyone, including us. I just wish there had been another way." "So do I'd replied. "Every day, I wish there had been another way." Emma had started sending me articles about international relations, foreign policy developments, security issues that connected to my areas of expertise. It was her way of including me in her academic interests, of building a relationship around the work that had once separated us. "I want to understand the world you were protecting," she'd said. "I want to know why it mattered enough for you to sacrifice so much." The recognition that had come with the White House ceremony had brought unexpected opportunities, speaking engagements, consulting offers, requests for interviews about my career, and the sacrifices made by intelligence families. I'd accepted some and declined others, choosing carefully which aspects of my story to share publicly. "Your narrative matters," my literary agent had said during our first meeting. "Military families need to see that these conflicts are real, that the choice between duty and family isn't theoretical for people in your position." I was considering writing a memoir, not about the classified details of specific operations, but about the personal cost of service, the weight of secrets, the challenge of maintaining family relationships while protecting national security. The story would be for other military families, other intelligence officers, other parents who were struggling to balance duty and love. But the most important writing I was doing was simpler. Long emails to Emma and Jake, sharing memories from their childhoods that I'd missed, stories about my missions that I could finally tell, explanations for absences that had puzzled and hurt them for years. "I remember when you won the science fair in 6th grade, I wrote to Emma. I was in Eastern Europe, preventing weapons smuggling that would have armed terrorist cells across 3 countries. I watched Mrs. Henderson's video of your acceptance speech on a secure tablet in a hotel room in Prague. And I cried because I was so proud of you and so sorry I wasn't there to share that moment." Each email was a small act of reconciliation, a way of building bridges across the years of silence and secrecy that had defined our relationships. The retirement shadow box in my own home contained the artifacts of a career that had required everything and given back recognition that came too late to change the past but might be enough to build a different future. The medals and commendations represented lives saved and operations completed, but they also represented birthdays missed and promises broken. The woman who had saved thousands of strangers was learning to be present for her own children, discovering that love required a different kind of courage than duty had demanded. The skills that had made me an effective intelligence officer: compartmentalization, emotional distance, the ability to prioritize mission over personal needs, were exactly the skills I needed to unlearn in order to be the mother and grandmother I hoped to become. "I'm dating someone," Emma told me during one of our video calls, her face lighting up with the kind of happiness I'd rarely seen during her teenage years. "Tell me about him," I said, settling in for the kind of conversation we'd never had before. Normal mother-daughter talk about relationships and feelings and future plans. "His name is David," she said, and my heart caught at the name. "He's studying international law, wants to work for the State Department someday. He thinks what you did was incredible." David, like her father, like the man who'd understood the weight of service and the cost of duty. Maybe Emma was drawn to people who could comprehend the complexity of loving someone whose life belonged partially to something larger than family. "I'd like to meet him," I said, meaning it in a way I'd never meant such statements before. For the first time, I had the luxury of curiosity about my children's lives, the freedom to be interested without being interrupted by classified emergencies. "He wants to meet you too," Emma said. "He's writing a paper on intelligence operations and family sacrifice. He thinks you'd be a valuable interview subject." The idea of being studied academically was both flattering and strange. My life had become a case study in the personal costs of public service, a cautionary tale about the price of choosing duty over family. If my experience could help other military families navigate similar challenges, perhaps some good could come from the pain I'd caused. Jake had started bringing friends home for weekend visits, introducing me as my mom, the former intelligence officer, with a pride that still surprised me. His Stanford classmates would ask careful questions about my career, their curiosity evident but respectful. Mrs. Mattia, one of them, had asked during his last visit, "Do you think the sacrifices were worth it?" "That depends on how you measure worth," I'd replied. "If you measure by lives saved and attacks prevented, then yes. If you measure by family relationships and personal happiness, the answer is more complicated." The question had led to a long conversation about service and sacrifice, about the different ways people contribute to society, about the importance of finding balance between public duty and private relationships. These young people would become leaders in their chosen fields, and maybe my experience could help them make better choices than I had. The most profound change in my retirement was the simple luxury of being available. When Emma called upset about a difficult exam, I could talk as long as she needed without worrying about classified briefings. When Jake needed advice about choosing classes, I could research options and offer guidance without being interrupted by mission alerts. "This is what having a mom feels like," Jake had said after one of our longer conversations about his future plans. The comment was both heartbreaking and hopeful. Heartbreaking because it highlighted everything he'd missed. Hopeful because it suggested our relationship could still grow into something meaningful. I'd started volunteer work with military family support organizations, using my experience to help other parents navigate the challenges of balancing service and family. The conversations were difficult but necessary, filled with the same struggles I'd faced throughout my career. How do you explain to a 6-year-old that mommy can't come to her birthday party because of national security? One Navy wife had asked, during a support group meeting. "You can't," I'd replied honestly. "You can't make a child understand that abstract concept. All you can do is be present for the moments you don't miss, and hope that love is stronger than absence." These discussions reminded me that my story wasn't unique, that thousands of military families made similar sacrifices daily. My recognition had been unusual, but the struggle was universal. Perhaps sharing my experience could help others find better solutions than I had. The teaching position at Georgetown had evolved into something more than I'd expected. Students would stay after class to discuss their own family military backgrounds, their questions about service and sacrifice, their concerns about following career paths that might require similar choices. Professor Mattia, one student, had said, "My father was deployed for most of my childhood. I want to serve, but I also want to be present for my future children. How do I reconcile those desires?" "By learning from people like me," I'd replied. "By recognizing that duty and family don't have to be mutually exclusive, that service can take many forms, that the most important mission might be raising children who understand both love and sacrifice." The medal ceremony had been the public recognition of my service, But the real victory was smaller, more personal. Emma calling just to chat. Jake including me in his weekend plans, family dinners where we talked about everything and nothing, the ordinary intimacy that I'd sacrificed for extraordinary service. I'm proud of who you are, I told my children during one of our family dinners, not just because you survived having an absent mother, but because you became remarkable people, despite the challenges I put you through. We're proud of you too, Emma replied. It took us a while to understand what that meant, but we're proud of the work you did and the person you are. The future stretched ahead of Emma's graduation from Columbia. Jake's continued studies at Stanford. Potential grandchildren who might grow up with a grandmother who was actually present for birthdays and recitals and soccer games. The woman who had saved the world was learning to be part of a family, discovering that love was both simpler and more complicated than duty. My service was complete. My mission accomplished. My secrets finally shared with the people who mattered most. 23 years of sacrifice had ended with recognition and reconciliation, with the hope that the relationships damaged by duty might be stronger for having survived the test. The retired intelligence officer was learning to be just a mother, just a teacher, just a woman whose biggest concern was whether her children were happy rather than whether the world was safe. It was a smaller life in some ways, a quieter existence than the one that had taken me to every corner of the globe in service to strangers. But it was also the life I'd been protecting all along, the peaceful suburban existence where families could gather around dinner tables without fear, where children could grow up secure in their parents' love, where the greatest threat was algebra homework rather than international terrorism. The shadow box containing my medals would remain on display, a reminder of the work that had mattered and the price that had been paid. But the real legacy would be the relationships we built going forward, the family that had been broken by duty and was now healing through truth, love, and the simple miracle of being present for each other. After 23 years of saving everyone else, I was finally learning to be just a mother. And perhaps that would be the most important mission of all.